The thunder arrived like the devil's own war drums rolling across the Arizona Badlands with a fury that made even the hardest men pause in their work. Jacob Morrison stood on the weathered porch of his ranch house, his calloused hands gripping the wooden rail as he watched the storm devour the horizon. Lightning split the purple-black sky like God's own anger, illuminating the desert in stark, hellish snapshots that burned themselves into a man's memory. At 58, Jake had seen enough storms to know this one meant business, the kind that could wash away a season's work in an hour, or worse, bring visitors a man didn't want. In this corner of the Arizona territory, storms brought Apache raiders as often as they brought rain. Both could be equally deadly. "Boss?" Tom Bradley's voice cut through the thunder as the ranch foreman jogged across the yard, his weathered face grim beneath his hat brim. "Cattle are spooked something fierce. Found sign near the north pasture, unshod horses, maybe 6 riders." Jake's jaw tightened. Tom had been with him for 8 years, since before the trouble, since before Martha and little Samuel had been taken from him. If Tom said there was sign, there was sign. How fresh. No more than 2 hours. Could be they're just passing through, but with this storm coming. Tom didn't need to finish. They both knew that Apache war parties used storms for cover striking when the thunder masked the sound of hooves and the lightning provided perfect illumination for killing. Jake's hand instinctively moved to the Colt 45 at his hip, a motion as natural as breathing after 5 years of living on the edge of a knife. 5 years since that terrible morning when he'd returned from a cattle drive to find his home, burned his wife and 8-year-old son butchered with Apache steel. 5 years of sleeping with one eye open and his gun never more than arm's reach away. "Double the night watch," he ordered, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd commanded cavalry units before he'd ever thought to raise cattle. "Keep the men close to the house. And Tom." The first drops of rain struck his face like cold bullets, each one carrying the metallic taste of lightning and danger. But it wasn't the rain that made Jake's words die in his throat. It was the sound that came from his barn, a sound that didn't belong in any storm. A child's whimper. Jake's blood turned to ice water in his veins. Out here, 30 miles from the nearest settlement, the only children were the ones that raiders brought as captives, or the ones they left behind as bait. "You hear that?" Tom's hand was already on his rifle, the weapon appearing in his grip with the smooth efficiency of long practice. Jake knotted his own gun, clearing leather in one fluid motion. The whimper came again, barely audible above the thunder, but unmistakably human, unmistakably young, unmistakably terrified. They moved across the yard like ghosts, their boots making no sound on the hard-packed earth. The barn loomed before them, its massive doors hanging slightly ajar. Jake had secured those doors himself before supper, he was certain of it. Someone or something had been inside. Lightning illuminated the barnyard in stark relief, and for one impossible moment, Jake saw a small face peek around the edge of the door, dark eyes wide with terror framed by long black hair. Then darkness swallowed the vision, leaving him to wonder if his mind was playing tricks. But the whimper came again. Jake gestured for Tom to circle around back while he approached the front doors. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird, but his hands remained steady. 5 years of nightmares had taught him to function, despite the fear to push through the memories of his son's small body, broken and bloodied in the ashes of their home. He reached the barn doors and paused, listening. Above the storm's fury, he could hear something else: rapid, shallow breathing. More than one person, at least 2, maybe 3. All trying desperately to remain silent. With his free hand, Jake slowly pulled the door open wider. The hinges protested with a low groan that was immediately swallowed by another crash of thunder. "I know you're in there," he called out, his voice carefully controlled. "I'm not going to hurt you. Come out slow hands where I can see them." Silence. Then, so quietly he almost missed it, a voice like rustling leaves. "No hurt." The words were heavily accented, the English broken but understandable. Female, young, scared beyond measure. Jake's mind raced. Apache children learned English from captives, from the missions, from traders. But what were Apache children doing in his barn, apparently alone and terrified? "No hurt," he confirmed, holstering his weapon but keeping his hand close. "Come out. The storm's getting worse." A shadow moved in the depths of the barn, then another, slowly like wild animals emerging from hiding. Two figures stepped into the doorway. Jake's breath caught in his throat. Two girls. One perhaps 15, the other no more than 12. Their clothes were torn and filthy, hanging in rags from their thin frames. Their long black hair was matted with dirt and what looked like dried blood. But it was their eyes that hit Jake like a physical blow. Dark eyes that held too much knowledge, too much pain for children so young. The older girl stepped protectively in front of the younger one, her chin raised in defiance despite the fear that radiated from her like heat from a forge. A crescent-shaped scar marred her left cheek, the pale tissue standing out starkly against her copper skin. Her hand held something, a broken piece of barnboard pitiful as a weapon, but wielded with the determination of a cornered wildcat. "We no steal," she said, her voice stronger now but still thick with accent. "Only hide from storm. Go now if you say." Jake found himself staring into those dark eyes, and for a moment time seemed to fold in on itself. He saw his own son's eyes wide with trust and love in the moments before bedtime stories. He saw Martha's eyes warm with laughter as she watched their boy chase fireflies in the evening twilight. And now these eyes belonging to Apache children who should have been his enemies, filled with the same desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, they'd found someone who wouldn't hurt them. The younger girl swayed on her feet, and Jake realized with a shock that she was near collapse. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, her small hands shaking with what looked like hunger and exhaustion. "When did you last eat?" he asked gently. The older girl's defiant mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the desperate child beneath. 2 days, maybe 3. We lost count." "Jesus," Jake breathed. He looked past them into the barn, noting the makeshift nest they'd created in an empty stall the way they'd tried to cover their tracks. These weren't raiders or scouts. These were refugees. Tom appeared around the corner of the barn, his rifle trained on the girls. "Jake, step away from them. Could be a trap." The older girl immediately pushed her sister behind her, raising her pitiful weapon. "We no trap. We no hurt anyone. Easy, Tom." Jake held up a hand, never taking his eyes off the girls. "They're just children." "Apache children," Tom spat. "You know what their people did to Martha and Samuel? Hell, Jake, you know what they're capable of." The words hit their mark, and Jake felt the familiar fire of rage and grief burn in his chest. Yes, he knew what the Apache were capable of. He'd buried the proof of it 5 years ago. But looking at these two starving, terrified girls, he couldn't reconcile them with the monsters that haunted his nightmares. "We know Apache," the older girl said suddenly, her voice desperate. "We outcast. Our people. They want us dead too." Tom snorted in disbelief. "That's what they all say." But Jake was studying the girl's face, noting the intelligence in her eyes, the careful way she chose her words. There was more to this story, he was certain of it. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated, glancing at her sister, then back at him. "I am Ayana. This is Kaya, my sister." She pronounced the names with careful precision, as if they were precious things not to be wasted on unworthy ears. "Ayana," Jake repeated, and saw something flicker in her eyes at his pronunciation. "Why are your people hunting you?" Before she could answer, the storm exploded around them with renewed fury. A bolt of lightning struck somewhere close enough to make the ground shake, followed immediately by thunder that seemed to crack the world in half. The horses in the corral began screaming in terror, and somewhere in the distance, Jake heard the unmistakable sound of cattle stampeding. "Inside!" he ordered, his military training taking over. "All of us, now!" But as they turned toward the house, Tom's hand clamped down on Jake's arm. "You can't be serious about bringing them inside. They're Apache, Jake, the same ones who killed your family." Jake looked at his foreman, this man who'd stood by him through the worst years of his life, and saw the genuine concern in his weathered features. Tom wasn't wrong to be cautious. In this part of the territory, caution kept you alive. But something in Jake's gut told him these girls were different. "They're children, Tom. Starving children." So was the boy they found near Tucson last month. Had his throat cut by a 10-year-old Apache girl they thought was harmless. The words hung between them like a challenge, and Jake felt the weight of decision pressing down on him. Every rational part of his mind screamed that Tom was right. These were Apache children, and in the 5 years since Martha and Samuel's death, he'd learned to trust no one with copper skin and dark eyes. But the younger girl, Kaya, chose that moment to collapse. She folded like a broken flower, her small body hitting the ground with a soft thud that somehow carried more weight than thunder. Ayanna cried out and dropped to her knees beside her sister, her broken board forgotten as she gathered the younger girl into her arms. "Kaya, Kaya, wake up!" The words were in Apache now, rapid and desperate, but the love in them transcended language. Jake found himself moving without conscious thought, dropping to his knees beside the girls. Kaya's face was pale beneath her copper skin, her breathing shallow and rapid. When he pressed his fingers to her wrist, her pulse fluttered like a dying bird. "She's dehydrated," he said, his voice tight with concern. "Maybe worse. When did she last drink water?" "Yesterday morning." Ayanna whispered, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "We found a little in a rock pool, but not much. I gave her most of it." The simple statement hit Jake like a physical blow. Here was this girl, barely 15 herself, giving up her own survival for her younger sister. It was exactly what Martha would have done for Samuel, exactly what any loving sibling would do for family. "Tom," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had once commanded soldiers. "Help me get them inside." "Jake." "Now, Tom." The foreman's jaw worked for a moment, but he nodded and moved to help lift Kaya's unconscious form. The girl weighed almost nothing, her small body light as a bird's in Jake's arms. They carried her through the rain toward the house, Ayanna close behind them like a protective shadow. The porch steps creaked under their weight as they climbed toward the warmth and safety of the ranch house. Jake kicked open the door and carried Kaya toward the kitchen, where the cast-iron stove still radiated heat from the evening's cooking. He laid her gently on the worn wooden table, noting how her ribs showed clearly through her torn shirt. "Water," he ordered, and Ayanna immediately moved toward the pump by the sink. Not too much at first, just wet her lips. As Ayanna carefully dripped water into her sister's mouth, Jake studied the two girls in the lamplight. They were clearly sisters, the same high cheekbones, the same graceful build. But there were differences too. Ayanna had that distinctive scar, and her eyes held a sharpness that spoke of intelligence and experience beyond her years. Kaya, even unconscious, had a gentleness about her that reminded Jake painfully of his own son. "Where are your parents?" he asked quietly. Ayanna's hand stilled on her sister's forehead. "Dead. Killed 3 months ago." "Apache raiders?" "No." Her voice was barely a whisper. "White soldiers. An Apache who called our father a traitor." Jake frowned. The story was getting more complex, and he found himself genuinely curious, despite his better judgment. Why would they call him a traitor? Before Ayanna could answer, Kaya's eyes fluttered open. She looked around with the confused disorientation of someone pulled back from the edge of consciousness, her gaze finally settling on Jake's face. For a moment, she just stared at him with those impossibly dark eyes. Then she smiled. It was a small thing, that smile weak and trembling. But it carried such innocent trust that Jake felt something crack inside his chest. When was the last time anyone had looked at him without fear or calculation? When was the last time he'd seen such pure, uncomplicated faith in another human being? "Thank you," Kaya whispered in English that was surprisingly clear for one so young. "You have kind eyes." Jake's throat tightened unexpectedly. Martha had always said he had kind eyes back in the days before grief and rage had carved lines around them. He'd thought those eyes were gone forever, buried with his family in the little cemetery behind the house. "You need food," he said gruffly, turning away to hide the emotion in his face. "Both of you." As he moved toward the pantry, Tom caught his arm again. "Jake, think about what you're doing. Word gets out you're harboring Apache children, and you'll have every rancher in the territory thinking you've gone soft, or worse, that you're collaborating." "Let them think what they want," Jake replied, but Tom's words carried weight. In the Arizona territory of 1879, perception was often more important than reality. A man's reputation could mean the difference between neighborly help and a lynch mob. He pulled bread and cold beef from the pantry along with a jar of Martha's preserved peaches. The sight of the familiar handwriting on the label, Summer 1874, sent a familiar stab of grief through his chest. the last batch she'd ever made. Slowly, he warned as he set the food before the girls. Your stomachs aren't ready for much. Ayanna nodded, breaking off small pieces of bread and feeding them to her sister with the patience of a saint. Jake watched the care she took, the way she tested each piece to make sure it wasn't too big, and felt that strange cracking in his chest widen a little more. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the ranch. Rain drummed against the windows like gunfire, and the wind howled around the eaves with a sound like mourning spirits. But inside the kitchen, warmed by lamplight and the simple act of feeding hungry children, Jake felt something he hadn't experienced in 5 years: peace. It lasted exactly 17 minutes. The first shot shattered the kitchen window, sending glass exploding across the room like deadly rain. Jake hit the floor instinctively, his body covering Kaya's as fragments peppered the walls where they'd been standing. Tom dove behind the heavy oak table, his rifle appearing in his hands as if by magic. "Apache!" he shouted over the sudden war cries that rose above the storm. "They've found us!" More shots rang out, the distinctive crack of rifles mixing with the deeper boom of old muskets. But it was the sound that came next that made Jake's blood freeze in his veins, the high, ululating war cry of Apache warriors in full attack. Ayanna grabbed her sister and pulled her toward the back of the kitchen, her eyes wide with terror that went beyond simple fear. This was the look of someone who recognized exactly what was coming, someone who'd seen it before. "They come for us," she whispered, her face pale as moonlight. "They find us." "Who?" Jake demanded, checking his weapons with the automatic precision of long practice. "Who's coming for you?" But before she could answer, another volley of shots exploded around them, and Jake heard the distinctive sound of his front door splintering under assault. Heavy footsteps pounded across the porch, and voices shouted commands in rapid Apache. Through the shattered window, Jake caught glimpses of figures moving in the storm-lashed darkness. At least 6 men, maybe more, all carrying rifles and moving with the coordinated precision of experienced warriors. But something was wrong with the picture. These weren't random raiders hitting an isolated ranch. They were moving too purposefully, heading straight for the house like they knew exactly what they were looking for. Or who? "The root cellar," Jake ordered, grabbing Ayanna's arm. "There's a hidden door behind the pantry. Take your sister and hide." "No." Ayanna shook her head violently. "They kill you if you help us. We go, they maybe leave you alone." "Like hell." Jake's voice carried the hard edge of command that had once moved soldiers into battle. "You're children, and you're under my protection now." The look that passed between the sisters was swift, but loaded with meaning. Some kind of decision was reached because Ayanna nodded and began pulling Kaya toward the back of the kitchen. But the younger girl resisted, her small hand catching Jake's sleeve. "You good man," she said, her English carefully pronounced. "We bring danger to good man is not right." Jake looked down into those dark eyes, seeing his own son's face for just a moment, and felt something settle into place inside his chest. A decision made a line drawn in the sand. "Sometimes doing right means accepting danger," he told her gently. "Go hide. I'll handle this." Another window exploded inward, and Tom's rifle barked in response. Outside, someone screamed in pain, but the war cries continued unabated. Jake pushed the girls toward the pantry just as the kitchen door burst open and the first Apache warrior stepped through. He was tall and lean, his face painted with white and red stripes that made him look like death itself in the lamplight. Feathers decorated his long black hair, and his chest bore the scars of someone who'd seen many battles. Most importantly, his dark eyes held the cold calculation of a killer who'd found his prey. Those eyes swept the room, passing over Jake and Tom, and settled unerringly on the spot where Ayanna and Kaya crouched behind the overturned table. "Give us the cursed ones," he said in English that was perfect and unaccented. "Give us the daughters of the traitor and you live." Jake's mind raced. The daughters of the traitor. What had Ayanna's father done to mark his children for death among their own people? "I don't know what you're talking about," Jake replied, his gun trained on the warrior's chest. "There's no one here but my men and me." The Apache smiled, and it was one of the most terrifying expressions Jake had ever seen. "You lie, white man. We tracked them here. The cursed one's blood calls to us like a beacon. She cannot hide from what she is." Behind the table, Jake heard Ayanna whisper something in Apache. The word sounded like a prayer, or maybe a curse. What did she say? The warrior called out, his voice mocking. Did she tell you what she is, white man? Did she tell you why her own people want her dead? Jake's grip tightened on his gun. Whatever Ayanna was hiding, whatever had marked these girls for death, it didn't matter. They were children, and they were under his roof. Only thing I need to know is that you're on my land without permission, he said. Leave now, and we'll call it even. The warrior's laugh was like the sound of breaking glass. You would die for the cursed one. You would spill your blood for the daughter of shame. I'd spill blood for any child that needed protection, Jake replied, and was surprised to find he meant it completely. The warrior's eyes narrowed and Jake saw death looking back at him, but before either man could fire, young Kaya did something that changed everything. She stood up from behind the table. Na'alnish, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the room. The single word was spoken in Apache, but Jake could hear the weight of it, the power and the pain. The warrior's face went white beneath his war paint. He actually took a step backward, his rifle wavering in his grip. You know me, killer of children. Kaya continued, now switching to English. You know what I am, what I see. You want to spill blood in this good man's house. You want to bring the curse of kinslaying upon your head. Jake stared at the 12-year-old girl, hardly recognizing the commanding voice that had emerged from her small form. This wasn't the half-starved child he'd been feeding minutes ago. This was someone else entirely. Someone who clearly held power even over seasoned Apache warriors. The warrior Nalnish seemed frozen, his eyes locked on Kaya's face as if he were seeing a ghost. The spirits protect this place now, Kaya announced, her voice rising with an authority that seemed impossible from someone so young. The spirits protect this man who showed mercy to the lost ones. You bring violence here. You bring the anger of the ancient ones upon your people. You cannot speak for the spirits, Nalnish snarled, but Jake could hear the uncertainty in his voice. Can I not? Kaya stepped fully into the lamplight and Jake gasped. Her eyes were no longer the warm brown they'd been before. They were solid black, reflecting the light like obsidian mirrors, and around her the very air seemed to shimmer with heat that had nothing to do with the kitchen stove. I speak with the voice of she who walks between worlds, Kaya said, her voice now carrying harmonics that seemed to come from multiple throats. I speak with the authority of blood spilled unjustly, of children made orphans by the pride of men. You know me, Nalnish, you know what I am. The Apache warrior's rifle fell from nerveless fingers, clattering to the floor. Behind him, Jake could hear the other warriors shuffling nervously, their own war cries dying to uncertain murmurs. The Vision Walker, Nalnish breathed, but you are only a child. I am the daughter of Standing Bear, keeper of the old ways, Kaya replied. I am the granddaughter of White Dove, who spoke with the spirit wolves. My blood carries the voices of 7 generations of medicine women, and they all cry out against the injustice you would do here. Jake watched in stunned silence as the 12-year-old girl faced down a room full of armed warriors with nothing but words and presence. Whatever was happening here went far beyond his understanding, but he could feel the power in the air like electricity before a lightning strike. The cursed one must die, Nalnish said, but his voice lacked conviction. She bears the mark of the star that fell. She brings disaster to all who shelter her. She bears the mark of destiny. Kaya corrected, her obsidian eyes never leaving the warrior's face. The scar on her cheek was not made by falling, but by the touch of the star spirits themselves. They marked her as one who would bridge 2 worlds, one who would bring peace between the Apache and the White Eyes. Jake's mind reeled. A bridge between worlds. He looked at Ayanna, crouched behind the table with tears streaming down her scarred cheek, and tried to reconcile this terrified girl with the mystical figure her sister was describing. Your father believed in peace, Nalnish spat. Look where it got him. Look where it got your mother. My father died because small men feared his vision, Kaya replied, but his vision lives on in his daughters, and it will not be stopped by warriors who have forgotten the difference between strength and brutality. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. Jake could feel Tom beside him ready to fight, but somehow understanding that this was bigger than any gunfight. This was about prophecy and destiny and powers that white men weren't supposed to believe in. Then, impossibly, Nalnish bowed his head. We cannot stand against the Vision Walker, he said quietly, even if she is only a child. I'm old enough to speak truth, Kaya replied, her voice gentling slightly. And the truth is that violence here tonight serves no one. My sister and I are no threat to the Apache people. We seek only to live in peace to honor our father's memory in our own way. The mark. The mark is not a curse, Nalnish. It is a blessing. One day when the anger has faded and the wisdom has grown. You will understand this. The warrior looked up, and Jake was shocked to see tears in his eyes. What would you have us do, Vision Walker? How do we face our people if we return without the cursed one? Kaya was quiet for a long moment, her black eyes staring into some distance only she could see. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of prophecy. Tell them the stars themselves protect her now. Tell them the white eye with the kind heart has been chosen by the spirits to guard the bridge walker until her time comes. Tell them that anyone who raises a hand against this house will answer to the ancient ones themselves. Naalnish nodded slowly, understanding passing between him and the girl like a current. He picked up his rifle and backed toward the door, his eyes never leaving Kaya's face. It will be as you say, Vision Walker. But know this, there are others who will not be stopped by warnings of spirits, others who serve different masters than the Apache people. I know, Kaya replied simply, but tonight this house is safe. Tonight the spirits stand watch. The warrior disappeared into the storm, and his companions melted away after him like shadows. Within moments, the only sound was rain against the broken windows and the distant rumble of thunder. Jake stood frozen, his gun still in his hand, trying to process what he'd just witnessed. The small girl before him still had those impossible black eyes, but even as he watched, they began to fade back to their normal brown. Kaya! Ayana's voice was whisper-soft, filled with awe and concern. The younger girl swayed on her feet, the commanding presence that had filled the room moments before, draining away like water from a broken cup. She looked suddenly very young again, very tired and very human. I'm all right, she said, but her voice was her own again, the voice of a 12-year-old who'd been through too much. But we can't stay here long. Others will come, others who won't listen to warnings about spirits. Jake finally found his voice. What in God's name just happened here? Ayana helped her sister to a chair, her movements gentle and protective. My sister has the gift of speaking with the spirits. It runs in our family, but it's strongest in her. That was more than speaking with spirits, Tom said from his position behind the overturned table. His voice shook slightly. I've been around Apache all my life, and I've never seen anything like that. Kaya looked up at Jake with tired eyes that held depths no child should possess. I see things sometimes. Things that were things that might be. The spirits of our ancestors, they guide me when the need is great. And you saw something tonight, Jake said. It wasn't a question. I saw death coming to this house, Kaya replied simply. I saw good people dying because of us, so I did what I had to do to stop it. Jake sank into a chair, the weight of the evening pressing down on him like a physical thing. These weren't just Apache children. They weren't even just refugees. They were something else entirely, something that brought both danger and destiny in equal measure. The warrior called your father a traitor, he said to Ayana. What did he mean? Ayana's hand went unconsciously to the scar on her cheek. Our father. Standing bare was a chief who believed in peace with the white settlers. He thought there could be a way for both peoples to share the land. A lot of Apache believe that, Tom pointed out. Not the way our father did. Ayana's voice was heavy with old pain. He was working with the territorial governor trying to negotiate a permanent peace treaty. He was going to meet with representatives from Washington to speak for our people in the white man's government. Jake frowned. In all his years in the territory, he'd never heard of such negotiations. What happened? He was betrayed, Kaya said quietly. Someone told the military where to find him when he was traveling to the meeting. Soldiers attacked our village while most of the warriors were away hunting. They said they were looking for weapons, but they killed anyone who tried to stop them. Including your parents. Our father died protecting the sacred objects of our people, Ayana said. Our mother died protecting us. We escaped into the desert with nothing but the clothes we wore. And you've been running ever since. Not just running, Kaya said, her young voice carrying an edge of steel. Hiding. There are people both Apache and white who want us dead because of what our father tried to do. Jake looked at the two girls, seeing them clearly for the first time since he'd found them in his barn. They weren't just orphans seeking shelter. They were the daughters of a peace chief marked for death by extremists on both sides. And somehow, Fate had dropped them into his life like a lit stick of dynamite. "Why here?" he asked. "Why my ranch?" Ayanna and Kaya exchanged one of their meaningful looks. It was Kaya who answered. "Because the spirits told me you would understand. Because you've lost children too. Because you have the kind of heart that chooses to protect rather than destroy." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. How could this child know about Samuel and Martha? How could she possibly understand the grief that had defined his life for 5 years? "The spirits tell you that." "The spirits tell me many things," Kaya replied, "but mostly they tell me that some people are chosen to stand between the darkness and the light. You are one of those people, Jacob Morrison." Hearing his full name spoken by this strange gifted child sent a chill down Jake's spine. He told them only his first name, and Tom always called him just Jake or Boss. "How do you know my name?" Kaya's smile was gentle and infinitely sad. "The same way I knew you would help us. The same way I knew this place would be safe, at least for tonight." Tom, who'd been listening to all this with growing disbelief, finally exploded. "This is insane, Jake. You're talking to these girls like they're some kind of prophets or something. They're children. Apache children who've probably been coached in exactly what to say to soft-hearted white folks." Jake looked at his foreman, this man who'd been his closest friend for 8 years, and saw the fear and suspicion in his weathered face. Tom wasn't wrong to be skeptical. In the cold light of reason, everything that had just happened did sound impossible. But Jake had felt the power in the air when Kaya faced down the warriors. He'd seen the terror in Nelnish's eyes when he'd recognized what the girl was. And most importantly, he'd felt something stir in his own chest when he'd looked into these children's faces, something he'd thought died with his family. "Maybe you're right, Tom," he said quietly. "Maybe I'm being a fool. But I've spent 5 years hating every Apache I've ever seen, and it hasn't brought Martha and Samuel back. It hasn't made the pain any less." He stood up and moved to the broken window, looking out at the storm-lashed darkness. "These girls need help. They're children, whatever else they might be. And maybe—" He paused, searching for words to explain what he was feeling. "Maybe this is my chance to do something good instead of just surviving." Tom's face was grim. "And when word gets out that you're harboring Apache kids, when the other ranchers start wondering if you've gone native, when the territorial government decides you're a security risk, then we'll deal with it when it happens. Jake?" The decision's made, Tom. Jake's voice carried the finality of command. "They stay, at least until we can figure out a safe place for them to go." Tom stared at him for a long moment, then shook his head. "I hope you know what you're doing, boss, because this is going to change everything." As if to underscore his words, the storm outside began to intensify. Lightning flashed with increasing frequency, and the thunder rolled across the Badlands like the drums of an approaching army. In the distance, Jake could hear his cattle lowing, nervously spooked by the electrical disturbance. But it was a different sound that made him freeze, the sound of hoofbeats approaching through the storm. "More company," Tom said grimly, checking his rifle. Jake moved to the shattered window and peered out into the darkness. Lightning illuminated the scene in stark snapshots, 6 riders approaching the house, but these weren't Apache warriors. These were white men wearing the broad-brimmed hats and long coats of professional gunmen. "Trouble," he muttered. Ayanna appeared at his shoulder, her face pale with new terror. "Bounty hunters," she whispered. "They've been tracking us for weeks." "What bounty hunters?" "The territorial government has offered a reward for information leading to our capture." Kaya said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "Dead or alive." Jake's blood chilled. "Why would the territorial government want 2 Apache children?" "Because we know the truth about what happened to our father," Ayanna replied. "Because we can identify the men who betrayed him. Because we're the only witnesses to murder that goes all the way to the top of the territorial administration." Before Jake could process this revelation fully, one of the riders outside called out in a voice that carried clearly over the storm. "Morrison, we know you've got Apache kids in there. Send them out and nobody gets hurt." Jake recognized the voice. Blackjack Cordero, a bounty hunter with a reputation for brutality that extended across 3 territories. If Cordero was involved, these girls were in more danger than he'd imagined. "Stay back," he ordered the girls, then called out the window. "This is private property, Cordero. You've got no business here." "I've got territorial warrants, Morrison. Those kids are wanted for questioning in connection with Apache raids." You're harboring fugitives. Jake's mind raced. Territorial warrants gave Cordero legal authority to search the ranch, and he had enough men to overwhelm Jake's small crew. But something about this felt wrong. If the girls were wanted for questioning, why had Apache warriors also been hunting them? Why did everyone seem to want these children dead? "Let me see the warrants," he shouted back. Cordero's laugh was ugly. "Don't need to show you nothing, Morrison. We're coming in." The bounty hunters spurred their horses toward the house, and Jake realized he was out of time for questions and deliberation. Whatever these girls were hiding, whatever danger they represented didn't matter now. They were children. They were under his roof, and men like Blackjack Cordero didn't leave witnesses. "Tom," he called, "positions, looks like we're going to have a fight." But even as he prepared to defend his home, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Whatever had started when he'd opened his barn door to two starving Apache girls was far from over. The storm crashed around them like the end of the world, and in the lightning-split darkness, armed men rode toward his house with murder in their hearts. Jake Morrison checked his weapons and prepared to make a stand that would define the rest of his life, however long that might be. The real question was whether he was fighting for justice prophecy or simply the right of children to live without fear. As the first shots rang out in the night, Jake realized he might never know the answer. But he was damn sure going to try to keep these girls alive long enough to find out. Blackjack Cordero's first bullet shattered what remained of Jake's kitchen window, sending glass fragments spinning through the lamplight like deadly snow. Jake rolled behind the cast-iron stove, pulling young Kaya with him, as lead slugs punched holes in the wooden walls where they'd been standing moments before. "Ayana!" he shouted over the gunfire. "Get your sister to the root cellar!" But the older girl was already moving her survival instincts honed by 3 months of running from men exactly like the ones now surrounding Jake's ranch house. She grabbed Kaya's hand and pulled her toward the pantry where a hidden trapdoor led to the cellar Jake had dug during his early paranoid years in Apache country. Tom Bradley's rifle barked from the front room, followed immediately by a scream from outside. The foreman might have his doubts about harboring Apache children, but he'd never backed down from a fight in his life. "Morrison?" Cordero's voice cut through the storm and gunfire like a rusty blade. "Last chance. Send out those Apache brats and we'll make this quick." Jake checked his Colt. 45. Noting he had maybe 20 rounds left for his sidearm and another 30 for the Winchester. Against 6 professional killers that wouldn't last long. But he'd been in worse spots during the war, and he'd learned that desperation could make a man dangerous in ways his enemies never expected. "Go to hell, Cordero," he called back, rising just long enough to put 2 rounds through the broken window. One of them found its mark. He heard a man curse and fall heavily off his horse. The bounty hunters responded with a volley that turned the kitchen into a storm of splinters and ricochets. Jake pressed himself against the floor, feeling the heat of bullets passing inches from his head. These weren't the random shots of angry cowboys. These were the calculated, methodical attacks of men who killed for money. During a brief lull in the shooting, Jake heard something that made his blood run cold, the sound of horses circling the house. Cordero was positioning his men for a coordinated assault, probably planning to hit the front and back doors simultaneously. "Tom," he called, "they're moving to surround us." "I see 'em," came the reply from the front room. "Got 2 more by the barn. Looks like they're trying to—" Tom's words were cut off by an explosion that shook the entire house. The front door had been blown clean off its hinges, and smoke poured into the hallway. Through the ringing in his ears, Jake heard boots pounding across his front porch, but it was the voice that came from behind him that made his heart stop. "Don't move, Morrison." Jake turned slowly to find a man standing in his kitchen doorway, not one of Cordero's riders, but someone who'd somehow gotten inside the house during the chaos. The stranger was tall and lean, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent his life in hard places. His clothes were expensive but practical, and his gun was pointed steadily at Jake's chest. "Who the hell are you?" Jake demanded. "Name's Captain Samuel Hayes, 7th Cavalry." The man's voice carried the crisp authority of a career military officer. "And I'm here to save your life whether you want me to or not." Jake's mind raced. A cavalry officer arriving in the middle of a gunfight with bounty hunters? Nothing about this made sense. "Save my life." Those men out there aren't just bounty hunters, Morrison. They're assassins working for men who'd rather see those Apache girls dead than answer uncomfortable questions about territorial corruption. Before Jake could respond, Hayes moved to the window and fired 3 quick shots in a pattern Jake recognized from his own military days, a signal to friendly forces. Almost immediately, the sound of gunfire outside changed. Instead of Cordero's men shooting into the house, Jake heard the distinct crack of military carbines returning fire from multiple directions. "What's happening out there?" he asked. "My men are evening the odds," Hayes replied calmly. "I've had Cordero under surveillance for weeks waiting for him to lead me to those girls. When he headed for your ranch tonight, I knew this was my chance." "Chance for what?" Hayes looked directly at Jake, and his eyes held the same kind of exhaustion Jake had seen in his own mirror for 5 years. "To get justice for a good man who was murdered for trying to make peace." The gunfight outside was intensifying, but it was clearly moving away from the house. Hayes's cavalry unit was driving Cordero's men back toward the desert, turning hunters into the hunted. "You knew Standing Bear," Jake said. "It wasn't a question. I was supposed to meet with him the day he was killed." Hayes's voice was tight with old pain. "I was the cavalry liaison assigned to his peace negotiations. When I arrived at the meeting point, I found his village burning and his family dead. Except for his daughters. Except for his daughters who'd somehow escaped into the desert. I've been searching for them ever since, trying to piece together what really happened that day." Jake's mind was working furiously, trying to fit these new pieces into the puzzle. "And what did you find?" Before Hayes could answer, Ayanna emerged from the pantry, her face pale but determined. "He found that my father was betrayed by the very people who asked him to negotiate for peace." Hayes turned toward her, and Jake saw something flicker across the cavalry officer's face, surprise, recognition, and something that might have been guilt. "Miss Standing Bear," Hayes said formally. "I'm Captain Samuel Hayes. I was your father's contact in the Territorial Administration." Ayanna studied him with those intelligent dark eyes that seemed to see more than they should. "You are the soldier who was supposed to protect him." "Yes, and I failed." The simple acknowledgement hung in the air between them, weighted with months of guilt and regret. Jake found himself reassessing everything he thought he knew about this situation. If Hayes was telling the truth, then the girls weren't just refugees. They were witnesses to a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. "Where's your sister?" Hayes asked. "Safe," Ayanna replied without elaborating. Jake noticed she didn't look toward the pantry where Kaya was hidden. These children had learned paranoia the hard way. Outside, the sound of gunfire was tapering off, replaced by shouted commands and the sound of horses moving at speed. Hayes moved to the window and looked out into the storm-lashed darkness. "Cordero's men are retreating," he reported. "My unit will pursue them, but they know this country too well. They'll escape tonight." "To try again another day," Jake said grimly. "Not if I can help it." Hayes turned back to face them, his expression grim. "Miss Standing Bear, I need to know everything your father told you about the peace negotiations. Every name, every meeting, every detail you can remember." Ayanna's hand moved unconsciously to the scar on her cheek. "Why should I trust you? You said you would protect him and he died." "Because I'm the only one left who believes in what your father was trying to accomplish," Hayes replied. "Because I've spent 4 months investigating his death and I know who ordered it. And because those men will never stop hunting you until they're brought to justice." Jake watched the exchange, seeing the intelligence and calculation in Ayanna's eyes. This girl had been through too much to trust easily, but she was also smart enough to recognize when she had no choice. "Who ordered my father's death?" she asked quietly. Hayes glanced at Jake, then back at Ayanna. "Territorial Governor Augustus Whitman and his chief advisor, a man named Marcus Reed. They were using the peace negotiations as a cover for illegal land seizures and arms dealing. Arms dealing. Your father discovered that Whitman was selling weapons to Apache raiders while simultaneously claiming he was trying to stop the violence. The raids gave him an excuse to call in federal troops and declare martial law, which allowed him to seize Apache land under the Homestead Act." Jake felt sick. He'd heard rumors of territorial corruption, but nothing like this. "You're talking about genocide for profit." "I'm talking about men who'd rather start a war than lose money," Hayes replied. "Your father threatened to expose the whole operation to Washington. That's why he had to die. Ayanna was quiet for a long moment processing this information. When she spoke again, her voice was steady but filled with rage. My mother died believing the soldiers came to arrest my father for raiding. My little cousins died thinking their grandfather was a criminal. You're telling me they all died so corrupt white men could steal land? I'm telling you they died because your father was a better man than the ones who were supposed to work with him, Hayes said gently, and I'm asking you to help me prove it. Before Ayanna could respond, Kaya emerged from the pantry. Jake was surprised to see that her eyes were their normal brown again, not the obsidian black they'd been when she'd faced down the Apache warriors. But there was still something otherworldly about her presence, as if she carried invisible weight. The soldier speaks truth, she said simply. His heart grieves for our father and his hands are clean of our people's blood. Hayes stared at the younger girl, clearly recognizing something significant in her words. You're the vision walker. I'm Kaya, daughter of Standing Bear, keeper of the old ways. Her voice carried the same formal cadence Jake had heard when she'd confronted Nulnish. The spirits whisper of you, Samuel Hayes. They say you walk a path of honor in a world of shadows. Jake saw Hayes swallow hard, clearly moved by the girl's words. Can the spirits tell you how to end this? How to stop the killing? Kaya was quiet for a moment, her young face distant as if listening to voices only she could hear. The spirits say the truth must be spoken in the white man's courts. They say papers exist that prove the corruption, but they also say the guilty men will kill many before they allow themselves to be exposed. What papers? Hayes asked urgently. It was Ayanna who answered. My father kept records of all his meetings with territorial officials, names, dates, what was discussed. He told me he hid them before his last trip in case something happened to him. Jake felt his pulse quicken. Where? Ayanna hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. He gave them to someone he trusted, someone he said would know what to do with them if the worst happened. Who? A missionary woman named Sarah Whitmore. She runs a school for Apache children about 50 miles north of here near the Mogollon Rim. Hayes and Jake exchanged glances. The Mogollon Rim was some of the roughest country in Arizona territory, a maze of canyons and mesas that had hidden Apache war parties for generations. Getting there would be dangerous enough under normal circumstances. With bounty hunters and corrupt territorial officials hunting them, it would be nearly suicidal. We have to try, Hayes said as if reading Jake's thoughts. Those papers are the only proof we have. Without them, it's just the word of 2 Apache children against the territorial government. And with them we can bring down Whitman and everyone involved in this conspiracy. Jake looked at the 2 girls, these children, who'd somehow become the center of a territorial-wide corruption scandal. 3 hours ago, his biggest concern had been whether to take them in. Now he was contemplating a journey across some of the most dangerous territory in the Southwest, with professional killers on their trail, and the territorial government itself as their enemy. There's something else, Ayanna said quietly. Something I haven't told you about the papers my father hid. Jake braced himself for another revelation. With these girls, there always seemed to be another layer to the story. My father didn't just document the corruption, she continued. He documented something else, something he discovered during his negotiations that he said could change the balance of power in the entire territory. What kind of something? Hayes asked. Ayanna looked at her sister, who nodded almost imperceptibly. Some kind of permission passed between them. A map, Ayanna said. A map to Apache gold. The words hit the room like a thunderbolt. Jake had heard stories of Apache treasure, legendary caches of Spanish gold and silver that the tribes had supposedly hidden in secret locations throughout their territory. But he'd always assumed they were just stories, the kind of tales that kept prospectors and treasure hunters busy in saloons. You're talking about actual gold, he asked. Spanish gold taken from conquistadors centuries ago, Kaya explained, hidden by our ancestors in sacred places guarded by the spirits of the dead. My father was the keeper of one such location. Hayes was staring at the girls with new understanding. That's why Whitman really wanted your father dead. It wasn't just about the peace negotiations, it was about the gold. My father offered to share the location with the territorial government as part of the peace treaty, Ayanna said. He thought if the Apache could contribute to the territory's wealth, it would prove we wanted to be partners, not enemies. But Whitman wanted it all, Jake concluded. Whitman wanted the gold, the land, and the Apache eliminated as a people. Kaya said, her young voice carrying ancient sadness. He saw our father's offer not as partnership, but as weakness to be exploited. Jake's mind was reeling. These girls weren't just witnesses to political corruption. They were the key to a treasure that could fund armies or build cities. No wonder everyone from Apache warriors to territorial officials wanted them dead or alive. "Where's this gold supposed to be?" he asked. "That's what the map shows," Ayanna replied. "But it's not just a simple treasure map. It's written in the old Apache way, using symbols and landmarks that only someone who understands our culture could interpret. And you can interpret it. My father taught me to read the old symbols before he died, but I would need the papers from Sarah Whitmore to complete the map." He split the information between what he carried with him and what he left with her. Hayes stood up and began pacing his military mind, clearly working through the tactical implications. "So we have territorial officials who want the girls dead to cover up their corruption. We have Apache factions who want them dead for cultural reasons, and we have bounty hunters who want them dead for money, all while they're carrying the secret to a fortune in gold. Don't forget about Mexican bandits," Jake added dryly. "Once word gets out about Apache gold, every treasure hunter and outlaw in 3 territories will be after them." "The spirits say the path will be difficult," Kaya said quietly. "But they also say it must be walked. Too much blood has been spilled in silence. The truth must be spoken." Jake looked at this 12-year-old girl who spoke with the authority of ancient prophets, then at her sister who carried the secrets of territorial corruption and legendary treasure. Finally, he looked at Hayes, a cavalry officer who was risking his career to seek justice for a murdered Apache chief. "All right," he said. "I'm in." Hayes raised an eyebrow. "You sure about that, Morrison? This isn't your fight." Jake thought about that for a moment, considering everything that had brought him to this point. The death of his family, the years of bitter isolation, the moment when he'd chosen to help 2 starving children despite every reason to turn them away. "Maybe it wasn't my fight this morning," he said, "but it is now." Outside, the storm was beginning to break up. Through the shattered windows, Jake could see patches of clear sky between the clouds and the first faint hint of dawn on the eastern horizon. But he knew the real storm was just beginning. "We'll need supplies," Hayes said, shifting into planning mode. "Food, ammunition, extra horses. The journey to the Mogollon Rim will take at least a week, and that's if we don't run into trouble." "When do we leave?" Jake asked. "Soon as possible. Cordero will be back with reinforcements, and once word reaches Whitman that his bounty hunters failed, he'll send the army after us." "The army?" "Whitman commands the territorial militia," Hayes explained. "He can claim we're harboring Apache fugitives and mobilize a full company to hunt us down. Our only chance is to reach Sarah Whitmore before he can organize a pursuit." Jake nodded, already mentally cataloging what they'd need for the journey. His ranch was well stocked with supplies, and he had good horses that could handle rough country. But traveling with 2 children through Apache territory while being hunted by both the law and outlaws would require more than just supplies. It would require luck. "There's something else we need to consider," Ayanna said. "Once we start this journey, there's no going back. People will die before it's over. Maybe good people." Jake looked at her, seeing the weight of adult responsibility in her 15-year-old eyes. This girl had been forced to grow up too fast to make decisions no child should have to make. "People are already dying," he replied. "Your parents, your family, probably others we don't even know about. Sometimes you have to choose between a hard path and a terrible one." Kaya nodded solemnly. "The spirits say this is the time of choosing, the time when each person must decide what they truly believe in." Hayes checked his pocket watch. "Dawn's coming. We need to move while we still have darkness to cover us." As they prepared to leave the only home Jake had known for the past 8 years, he found himself thinking about Martha and Samuel. What would they think of his decision to risk everything for 2 Apache children? Would they understand, or would they see it as a betrayal of their memory? But as he watched Ayanna help her younger sister pack their few belongings, he realized it didn't matter what anyone else would think. These girls had become his responsibility the moment he'd chosen to feed them instead of turning them away. And Jake Morrison had never been a man to abandon his responsibilities, no matter how dangerous they became. "Ready?" Hayes asked, shouldering his rifle. Jake took one last look around his kitchen, seeing it clearly in the growing dawn light. Bullet holes pocked the walls, glass covered the floor, and the smell of gunpowder hung in the air like incense. This room had been the heart of his home, with Martha the place where they'd planned their future and dreamed of the children they'd raise. Now it was a battleground marked by violence and the beginning of a journey that might well end in death for all of them. But as he turned toward the door, Jake felt something he hadn't experienced in 5 years: purpose. Real purpose, beyond mere survival or the empty rituals of daily existence. These girls needed him, and he needed to believe that he could still make a difference in a world that seemed determined to crush hope wherever it grew. "Let's go," he said. They slipped out of the ranch house into the pre-dawn darkness, 4 people bound together by circumstances none of them could have imagined. Behind them lay the wreckage of Jake's old life. Ahead lay the unknown dangers of a territory where corruption and violence ruled, where Apache gold might be real or might be legend, and where the line between justice and vengeance could disappear in the dust of a high desert morning. But they rode forward anyway, because sometimes the only choice that matters is the choice to keep moving when everything else has fallen apart. The sun was just breaking over the eastern mountains when they reached the first checkpoint of their journey, a decision point where the trail split 3 ways. One path led back toward civilization and the relative safety of settlements and cavalry posts. Another led deeper into the desert toward the hidden places where outlaws and renegades made their homes. The third led north toward the Mogollon Rim and Sarah Whitmore's mission school, toward answers, toward truth, and toward whatever destiny awaited 2 Apache girls who carried the secrets of territorial corruption and legendary treasure. Jake looked at his companions, a career cavalry officer risking everything for justice, a 15-year-old girl who spoke like a diplomat and thought like a strategist, and a 12-year-old who claimed to converse with spirits and had the power to back up her claims. It was, he reflected, probably the strangest group of allies ever assembled in the Arizona territory. But as Kaya urged her horse toward the northern trail, her young face set with determination that seemed to come from some source deeper than her years, Jake realized he wouldn't trade places with anyone else in the world. For the first time in 5 years, Jacob Morrison was exactly where he belonged. The real adventure was just beginning. As they rode north toward the rising sun, none of them looked back. There would be time for regrets later if they lived long enough to have them. For now, there was only the trail ahead, the promise of truth waiting to be uncovered, and the simple faith that sometimes the right choice is also the hardest one. Behind them, smoke rose from Jake's ranch house where oil lamps had been knocked over in the gunfight. The building that had sheltered his grief for 5 years was burning along with everything that had tied him to his past. Ahead of them, the Arizona territory stretched out like a promise and a threat full of dangers they could imagine and others they couldn't even dream of. But they rode on anyway, because that's what people do when they finally find something worth fighting for. The thunder of hoofbeats faded into the distance, swallowed by the vast silence of the desert morning. And somewhere in that silence, the spirits of the Ancient Ones whispered their approval to a young Apache girl who had chosen to trust her future to the kindness of strangers and the justice of a world that had shown her precious little of either. The second day of their new lives had begun. The third day of their journey dawned blood red over the Mogollon Rim, the ancient volcanic plateau that jutted from the Arizona territory like the backbone of some primordial beast. Jake Morrison watched the sunrise paint the sandstone cliffs in shades of copper and gold and tried not to think about how exposed they were on this narrow mountain trail. 20 feet below them yawned a canyon that dropped into darkness, its bottom lost in morning shadows. 20 feet above sheer rock walls offered perfect cover for anyone wanting to rain death down on travelers foolish enough to attempt this passage. "How much farther to the mission?" Captain Hayes asked, his voice tight with the strain of 3 days in the saddle while constantly watching for pursuit. Ayanna consulted the crude map she'd drawn from memory, her finger tracing the route her father had taken her on years ago when she was just a child. "Maybe 10 miles. But this is where the trail gets dangerous." "Gets dangerous," Jake muttered, eyeing the precipitous drop beside them. "What the hell would you call what we've been riding through?" The older girl managed a wan smile, the first one Jake had seen from her since they'd left his burning ranch house. "Apache country, Mr. Morrison. Everything from here on is sacred ground, the kind of place where spirits watch every move you make." As if summoned by her words, young Kaya suddenly stiffened in her saddle, her dark eyes going wide with that otherworldly awareness Jake had learned to recognize. The 12-year-old had been quiet for most of the journey, speaking only when necessary, and often staring into distances that held meaning only for her. "We're not alone," she said quietly. Hayes's hand moved instinctively to his rifle. "Hostiles. I don't know, the spirits are confused. There are many people watching us, but their intentions are unclear." Jake felt the familiar tightness in his gut that had kept him alive through 5 years of Apache raids. In this country, being watched usually meant being hunted, and after 3 days of pushing their horses hard through some of the roughest terrain in the Southwest, they were in no condition for a running fight. "How many?" he asked. Kaya closed her eyes, her young face taking on that eerie stillness that meant she was listening to voices only she could hear. "At least a dozen. Maybe more. They've been following us since yesterday, staying just out of sight." Hayes cursed under his breath. "Cordero's men." "Some," Kaya replied, her eyes still closed. "But not all. There are others Apache, but not the same ones who came to your ranch. And," she frowned as if trying to interpret something difficult, "and white men who smell of government offices and fear." Jake's blood chilled. If territorial officials were involved in the pursuit, it meant Governor Whitman had escalated from bounty hunters to a full military operation. They weren't just fugitives anymore, they were enemies of the state. "Can you tell how close they are?" Hayes asked. Before Kaya could answer, the crack of a rifle echoed off the canyon walls and rock chips exploded from the cliff face, inches from Jake's head. "Close enough," he shouted, spurring his horse forward as more shots rang out from the heights above them. What followed was the most terrifying ride of Jake's life, and that was saying something for a man who'd charged Confederate artillery at Gettysburg. The narrow trail ahead of them switched back and forth across the canyon wall like a snake's path, offering no cover from the shooters above while threatening to dump them into the abyss below at every turn. Ayanna rode like she'd been born in the saddle, her horse dancing through the switchbacks with sure-footed grace that spoke of years spent in country like this. But it was Kaya who amazed Jake the most. The young girl seemed to anticipate each curve of the trail before it appeared, guiding her mount with an almost supernatural awareness of the path ahead. There, Hayes pointed toward a narrow gap in the rock wall ahead of them. Cave entrance. The opening was barely wide enough for a horse and rider hidden behind a screen of juniper and piñon pine that made it nearly invisible from the trail. Jake might have ridden past it without noticing if Hayes's sharp eyes hadn't spotted the telltale darkness behind the vegetation. They plunged through the screening trees into a tunnel that seemed to lead straight into the heart of the mountain. Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew louder, horses scrambling down the canyon wall, men shouting orders in both English and Apache. The tunnel opened into a vast underground chamber, its ceiling lost in shadows above them. Ancient pictographs covered the walls, painted in colors that still held their vibrancy after centuries in the desert darkness. But it was what occupied the center of the chamber that made them all stop in wonder. An underground lake stretched before them, its surface so still it reflected the torchlight like a mirror of black glass. The water was fed by a spring that bubbled up from somewhere deep in the mountain, and the air above it shimmered with moisture that felt like paradise after 3 days in the desert heat. "Sacred place," Ayanna breathed, dismounting from her horse with the reverence of someone entering a church. "This is one of the old sanctuary caves where our people came to speak with the spirits." Kaya slid down from her mount and walked to the water's edge, her bare feet making no sound on the stone floor. She knelt and placed her hands on the surface, and Jake could swear he saw the water glow faintly in response to her touch. "The spirits say we're safe here," she announced. "This place is protected by the old covenants. No blood may be spilled on sacred ground." "That's all well and good," Hayes said, checking his weapons. "But what happens when our friends out there decide they don't care about Apache taboos? Then they die," Kaya replied with such matter-of-fact certainty that Jake felt a chill run down his spine. Before he could ask what she meant, voices echoed from the tunnel entrance their pursuers had found them. "Morrison." The voice belonged to Black Jack Cordero, and it carried the ugly satisfaction of a predator who'd finally cornered his prey. "No place left to run now." "Seems like we've got company," Jake muttered, positioning himself behind a large boulder near the tunnel mouth. Hayes took cover on the opposite side, his cavalry carbine ready. "How many rounds you got left?" "Enough," Jake replied grimly. It was a lie. He was down to maybe a dozen cartridges for his rifle and 8 for his sidearm. Against a dozen or more attackers, it wouldn't last long. But as the first figures appeared in the tunnel entrance, something extraordinary happened. The pictographs on the walls began to glow. It started as a faint phosphorescence barely visible in the torchlight. But as more armed men entered the sacred chamber, the ancient paintings blazed brighter until the entire cavern was lit by an eerie, pulsing radiance that seemed to come from the very stones themselves. "Jesus Christ," one of Cordero's men whispered, his rifle wavering as he stared at the glowing walls. "Just Apache witchwork," Cordero snarled, but Jake could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "Kill them all and be done with it." But before anyone could fire, Kaya stood up from beside the underground lake. The water around her feet was glowing now, a blue-white radiance that pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat. Her eyes had gone that impossible obsidian black again, and when she spoke, her voice carried the authority of ages. "You dare bring weapons into the presence of the Ancient Ones?" she asked, her words echoing strangely in the chamber. "You dare threaten blood in the sacred place of the first people?" One of Cordero's men, a hard-faced killer Jake recognized from wanted posters, actually took a step backward. "Boss, maybe we should—" "Shut up," Cordero snapped. "She's just a kid." "No," said a new voice from the tunnel entrance. "She's much more than that." A figure stepped into the chamber, and Jake's heart sank. He recognized the man immediately, Marcus Reed, Governor Whitman's chief advisor, and the architect of the conspiracy that had killed Standing Bear. Reed was a small, neat man with the pale complexion of someone who spent his life in offices, but his eyes held the cold calculation of a snake. Behind him came a squad of territorial militia, their blue uniforms marking them as official government forces. This was no longer a pursuit by bounty hunters. This was a military operation. "Miss Standing Bear," Reed said pleasantly, as if he were greeting her at a social function. "How nice to finally meet you. Your father spoke of you often during our negotiations." Ayanna stepped protectively in front of her sister, her hand moving to the knife at her belt. "You're the one who betrayed him." "I'm the one who tried to save him," Reed corrected. "Your father was a good man, but he was naive. He thought he could trust the federal government to honor a peace treaty. He thought Washington politicians cared about the welfare of a few thousand Apache. And you showed him how wrong he was." Reed's smile was as cold as winter moonlight. "I showed him reality. The Apache were going to be removed from their land one way or another. I offered your father a chance to profit from the inevitable to ensure his people got something of value in exchange for their cooperation." "You offered him blood money," Kaya said, her voice carrying that otherworldly resonance that made the chamber's walls pulse with brighter light. "You offered him the chance to sell his people's souls." Reed looked at the younger girl with genuine interest, apparently unimpressed by the supernatural display around them. "Ah, the famous Vision Walker. I've heard stories about you, child. Some of my Apache contacts are quite convinced you can speak with the dead." "I speak with those who watch over the living," Kaya replied. "And they tell me your soul is already forfeit." "Souls are luxury items," Reed said dismissively. "I deal in more practical commodities, like information, like leverage, like the location of certain Spanish gold deposits that could fund the territorial government for the next century." There it was, the real reason for the pursuit laid bare at last. Jake had suspected it wasn't just about covering up Standing Bear's murder. The territorial government wanted the gold, and they were willing to kill children to get it. "We don't know where any gold is," Ayanna said, but Jake could hear the lie in her voice. Reed heard it too. "Of course you do. Your father was the keeper of the old knowledge, and he passed that knowledge to his daughters before he died. The question is whether you'll share it willingly or whether we'll have to extract it from you piece by piece." The threat hung in the air like poison gas. Jake had heard enough stories about territorial interrogation methods to know that Reed wasn't bluffing. "The gold belongs to the Apache people," Ayanna said firmly. "It was hidden by our ancestors to protect it from Spanish conquistadors. It's not meant for white men's greed." "Everything in this territory belongs to the United States government," Reed replied. "Your people are wards of the state now. Any assets they possess revert to federal control." "Not while they live," Hayes said, stepping forward with his rifle trained on Reed's chest. Reed looked at the cavalry officer with mild surprise. "Captain Hayes, I should have known you were involved in this. You always were too idealistic for your own good." "I'm idealistic enough to believe in justice," Hayes replied, and justice says you murdered a good man who was trying to make peace. I eliminated a threat to territorial security, Reed corrected. Standing Bear was planning to take his grievances to Washington to accuse the territorial government of corruption and incompetence. That could have set back statehood by decades. So you had him killed. I did what was necessary to protect the greater good. Jake had heard enough political justification to last him a lifetime. These men would rationalize any atrocity if it served their purposes, would murder children and call it policy. Cordero, he called out, you really want to work for men who kill kids for money? The bounty hunter's face was grim, but his rifle never wavered. Money's money, Morrison, and these Apache brats are worth more alive than dead, at least until they tell us what we want to know. And after that, Cordero's silence was answer enough. Jake was calculating angles and distances, trying to figure out how to get the girls out of this chamber alive, when Kaya did something that changed everything. She walked into the underground lake. The water rose around her small form as she waded deeper, the blue-white glow intensifying with each step. When she was waist-deep in the sacred water, she turned to face their captors. You want Apache gold? She asked, her voice carrying clearly across the chamber. Then come and take it. She reached into her shirt and pulled out something that made everyone in the chamber gasp, a piece of bark covered with symbols and markings, obviously very old and very precious. This is the true map, she announced, the location of the greatest treasure cache ever hidden by our people. Enough gold and silver to buy armies, to build cities, to change the fate of nations. Reed's eyes were locked on the bark like a man dying of thirst, staring at water. Give it to me. Come and get it, Kaya replied, holding the map over the water. But know this, the moment you step into this sacred lake with violence in your heart, you forfeit your life to the Ancient Ones. Superstitious nonsense, Reed snapped, but Jake noticed he didn't move toward the water. It was one of Cordero's men who broke first, a young gunman whose greed overcame his caution. He stepped into the lake, his revolver trained on Kaya's small form. The water around his boots began to bubble and hiss like acid. The man screamed, trying to leap back onto dry ground, but his boots seemed stuck to the lake bottom. The water rose around his legs, and wherever it touched his flesh began to smoke and burn as if he'd stepped into molten metal. He fired wildly, his bullets going wide as agony destroyed his aim. Then the water closed over his head and he was gone, leaving only bubbles and the acrid smell of burning flesh. The chamber fell silent, except for the gentle lapping of water against stone. Who's next? Kaya asked pleasantly. Nobody moved. Even Reed had gone pale, his political cynicism struggling against the evidence of his own eyes. But Jake knew it wouldn't last long. Desperation and greed would overcome fear eventually, and then they'd all die in this sacred chamber, trapped between supernatural guardians and earthly enemies. That's when Ayanna made her move. The map my sister holds isn't the only one, she announced, stepping forward into the circle of torchlight. There are 3 pieces to the treasure location. One my father carried with him when he died, when he left with Sarah Whitmore at the mission, and one he gave to me. She reached into her own shirt and produced a second piece of bark, this one covered with different symbols but clearly part of the same set. This piece shows the landmarks that lead to the treasure, she continued. Without it, Kaya's piece is useless. Without both pieces, Sarah Whitmore's portion is meaningless. Reed was practically salivating. Give them to me, both pieces, now. I'll make you a deal, Ayanna said, and Jake heard the diplomatic skills that had made her father famous. Safe passage to the mission for all of us, and I'll help you recover all 3 pieces of the map. And why would you do that? Because I'm tired of running, because I want this to end, and because I know you'll hunt us forever if you don't get what you want. Reed considered this, his calculating mind weighing options and probabilities. What guarantee do I have that you won't simply run again once you're free? You have my word, Ayanna replied. The word of Standing Bear's daughter. The word of a savage child. The word of someone who wants to prevent more bloodshed, Ayanna corrected firmly. My father believed in peace, Mr. Reed. So do I. But I also believe in justice. Help us reach the mission safely and I'll help you find your gold. But I want your promise that no harm will come to my sister or to the men who've protected us. Jake stared at the 15-year-old girl, amazed by her poise and intelligence. She was negotiating like a seasoned diplomat, using the very greed that drove their enemies as leverage to protect the people she cared about. but he could also see the pain in her eyes, the terrible weight of responsibility she'd been forced to carry. This child was sacrificing her people's sacred treasure to save the lives of a few individuals, a choice that would haunt her forever. "Ayanna," he said quietly, "you don't have to do this." She looked at him with those ancient eyes, and he saw a wisdom that had nothing to do with age. "Yes, I do. Some prices are worth paying to protect the people you love." Reed was nodding slowly. "Very well. I accept your terms. Safe passage to the mission and no harm to your companions in exchange for your cooperation in recovering the complete map. Swear it on your honor as a government official." "I swear it on my authority as a representative of the United States government." Jake noticed that Reed had avoided swearing on his honor, probably because he didn't have any. But the man's word as a government representative might carry some weight, if only because breaking it publicly would damage his political career. "The deal is acceptable," Ayanna said formally. Then she looked at Kaya, still standing waist-deep in the glowing water. "Sister, it's time to come back." Kaya nodded and began wading toward shore, the map piece still clutched in her small hand. As she emerged from the lake, the supernatural glow began to fade from both the water and the pictographs, leaving them in the ordinary light of torches and lanterns. But Jake noticed that the girl's eyes remained that bottomless obsidian black, and the very air around her seemed to shimmer with barely contained power. "The spirits are not pleased with this bargain," she said quietly to Ayanna in Apache. "I know," her sister replied in the same language. "But sometimes we must choose between what the spirits want and what the living need." Reed was organizing his men, clearly eager to get moving toward the mission and the final piece of the treasure map. "Captain Hayes, you'll ride with me at the front of the column. Morrison, you and the children will be in the middle with Cordero's men as rear guard." "Prisoners, you mean," Jake said. "Honored guests," Reed corrected with a thin smile. "At least until we reach our destination." As they prepared to leave the sacred chamber, Jake found himself walking beside Ayanna. The girl's face was set with determination, but he could see the cost of her decision in the tight lines around her eyes. "You know he's lying," he said quietly. "Reed has no intention of honoring his word once he gets what he wants." "I know," she replied, "but this buys us time. Time to reach the mission, time to warn Sarah Whitmore, time to figure out our next move." "And if there is no next move, if we're walking into a trap?" Ayanna was quiet for a moment, then looked up at him with a sad smile. "Then at least we'll die trying to do the right thing. That's more than most people can say." Jake found he had no answer for that. This 15-year-old girl had more courage and wisdom than most grown men he'd known. Whatever happened at the mission, he was determined to see that her sacrifice wasn't wasted. They rode out of the sacred chamber into the afternoon sunlight, a strange procession of government officials, soldiers, bounty hunters, and refugees. Behind them, the ancient pictographs had returned to their normal appearance, but Jake could swear he felt eyes watching from the shadows, the eyes of spirits who were far from finished with the affairs of mortals. The trail to the mission wound through some of the most beautiful country Jake had ever seen, but he had no attention to spare for scenery. Every mile brought them closer to what might be their final destination, and every mile gave Reed's men more confidence that they were in control of the situation. But Jake had learned not to underestimate the daughters of Standing Bear. Ayanna had already proven she could think like a general when necessary, and Kaya's supernatural abilities were beyond anything he could have imagined. If this was a trap, it might not be the one Reed expected. As the sun began to sink toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold, Jake Morrison rode toward whatever destiny awaited at Sarah Whitmore's mission school, where the final secrets of Apache gold and territorial corruption would finally be revealed. Behind him rode two girls who carried the fate of a people in their hearts and the power of the ancient ones in their blood. Ahead of him rode the men who would kill them all, without hesitation once they got what they wanted. And somewhere between past and future, between justice and greed, between the living and the dead, the real battle for the soul of the Arizona Territory was about to begin. The fourth day of their journey was ending, but Jake had a feeling the real adventure was just getting started. After all, the most dangerous part of any treasure hunt isn't finding the gold. It's surviving long enough to enjoy it. The mission school sat like a beacon of hope against the darkening Arizona sky, its whitewashed adobe walls gleaming in the last rays of sunlight that filtered through the towering pines of the Mogollon Rim. But as their unlikely procession approached the cluster of buildings nestled in a mountain valley, Jake Morrison felt anything but hopeful. Sarah Whitmore's sanctuary looked peaceful enough. A main schoolhouse, several dormitory buildings, a small chapel with a wooden cross reaching toward heaven, and gardens where Apache children could be seen tending vegetables in the fading light. It was exactly the kind of place where a woman might dedicate her life to bridging two worlds, teaching Apache children to read and write while preserving their cultural heritage. It was also exactly the kind of place that would become a slaughterhouse once Marcus Reed got what he wanted. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Reed said, riding up beside Jake with the satisfied air of a man who'd already won the game. "Miss Whitmore has done remarkable work here. It would be a shame if anything unfortunate were to happen to it." The threat was clear enough. Jake's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice level. "You gave your word. No harm to anyone who's helped us." "And I'll honor that promise," Reed replied smoothly. "As long as everyone continues to cooperate. But if Miss Whitmore proves unreasonable about sharing the information she's been hiding. Well, accidents do happen in remote locations like this." Jake glanced at Ayanna riding silently between two of Cordero's men. The girl's face was a mask of calm determination, but he could see the tension in her shoulders the way her hand rested near the knife at her belt. She'd made this deal to protect the people she cared about, but Jake could tell she was already regretting the bargain. "Remember?" Reed continued, his voice taking on the tone of a man issuing orders. "Miss Whitmore is to hand over Standing Bear's papers voluntarily. I want this to look like cooperation, not coercion, at least until we have what we need." Captain Hayes, who'd been forced to ride at the front of the column under heavy guard, turned in his saddle. "And if she refuses?" Reed's smile was thin as winter ice. "Then we'll discover just how committed she really is to the welfare of her Apache students." The casual brutality of the threat made Jake's blood boil, but he forced himself to remain calm. Getting angry wouldn't help anyone right now. What they needed was a plan, and looking at the carefully positioned soldiers surrounding them, that plan would have to be very good indeed. As they drew closer to the mission, figures began emerging from the buildings. Jake counted at least 20 Apache children ranging in age from perhaps 6 to 16, along with several adult Apache who appeared to be teachers or staff. And leading them all, walking with the confident stride of someone accustomed to authority, came a woman who could only be Sarah Whitmore herself. She was younger than Jake had expected, perhaps 40, with graying brown hair, pulled back in a practical bun, and intelligent hazel eyes that missed nothing. Her simple blue dress was appropriate for frontier life, but there was something in her bearing that spoke of education and breeding. This was a woman who'd chosen to dedicate her life to a cause she believed in, regardless of personal cost. Those intelligent eyes swept over their approaching group, taking in the mix of government officials, soldiers, and obvious outlaws. When her gaze fell on Ayanna and Kaya, her face went pale with recognition, and something that might have been fear. "Miss Standing Bear," she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the valley, "I wasn't expecting you." "Circumstances changed," Ayanna replied carefully. "We need to talk." Sarah Whitmore's gaze shifted to Reed, and Jake saw her posture stiffen with instinctive distrust. "Mr. Reed, this is an unexpected pleasure." "Miss Whitmore." Reed dismounted with theatrical courtesy, but his men remained in their saddles, weapons clearly visible. "I hope you'll forgive the size of our escort. These are dangerous times in Apache country." "Indeed they are," Sarah replied, her tone dry. "Particularly for Apache children, it seems." Reed's smile never wavered. "May we come inside? We have business to discuss." Sarah looked again at Ayanna and Kaya, and Jake saw understanding pass between the missionary and the girls. Whatever Standing Bear had told this woman about his daughters, she recognized the danger they were in. "Of course," she said finally, "though I should mention that we're expecting visitors from the territorial capital tomorrow, officials from the Indian Affairs Office conducting their quarterly inspection." Reed's confident expression flickered for just a moment, the first crack Jake had seen in his political facade. The arrival of federal officials would complicate any plans for violence or coercion. "How convenient," Reed said. All the more reason to conclude our business quickly and amicably. They were led to the main schoolhouse, a large room with wooden desks arranged in neat rows and Apache children's artwork covering the walls. Maps and books lined the shelves, and a blackboard at the front of the room was covered with English words alongside their Apache translations. Sarah dismissed the curious children with a gentle but firm word, then turned to face her unexpected guests. "Now then, what brings the territorial government to my humble school?" Reed had recovered his composure, his political instincts taking over. "We're investigating some irregularities in the late Chief Standing Bear's activities before his death. We have reason to believe he left certain documents in your care." "I maintain correspondence with many Apache leaders," Sarah replied carefully. "Standing Bear was a friend of this mission, yes. A friend who entrusted you with papers that rightfully belong to the territorial government." Sarah's eyes hardened. "Standing Bear entrusted me with his children's future. Everything else is secondary." "Miss Whitmore," Reed's voice took on a more threatening edge, "I'm sure you're aware that harboring government documents without authorization is a serious federal crime, one that could result in the closure of this mission and the arrest of everyone associated with it." Jake watched the interplay between Reed and the missionary, recognizing the same kind of political maneuvering he'd seen during his Army days. Reed was applying pressure, gradually building up to his real demands while establishing the consequences of resistance. But Sarah Whitmore wasn't intimidated easily. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Reed?" "I'm explaining reality, Miss Whitmore. The documents Standing Bear left with you contain sensitive information about territorial security matters. They need to be returned to proper government custody." "And what about the girls?" Sarah asked, looking directly at Ayanna and Kaya. "What's to become of them once you have your documents?" "That's not your concern," Reed replied. But Jake caught the evasion in his answer. Sarah caught it too. "I'm afraid it is my concern. These children are under my protection now, just as they were under their father's protection when he was alive." "Their father is dead," Reed said bluntly. "Killed in a raid on a peaceful settlement. His protection ended when he chose violence over negotiation." Ayanna stepped forward, her young face blazing with righteous anger. "That's a lie. My father never raided anyone. He was murdered by your soldiers while traveling to a peace meeting you arranged." Reed turned to face her with mock sympathy. "My dear child, I understand your grief makes it difficult to accept the truth about your father's activities. But the evidence is quite clear. The evidence is in the papers you want so badly." Kaya interrupted, her voice carrying that otherworldly resonance that made everyone in the room pause. "The evidence that proves you arranged his death to steal our people's gold." Reed's mask slipped again just for a moment, revealing the cold calculation beneath. "I have no idea what you're talking about." "Don't you?" Sarah Whitmore's voice was quiet but deadly. "Because Standing Bear told me quite a lot about your negotiations, Mr. Reed. About how you promised him protection in exchange for information about Apache treasure sites. About how you plan to use that information to fund illegal arms deals with Mexican revolutionaries." The room went dead silent. Jake felt the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. This wasn't just about territorial corruption or Apache gold. This was about international arms trafficking, about using territorial resources to fund private wars across the border. Reed's hand moved toward his sidearm, but Captain Hayes was faster. The cavalry officer's rifle was suddenly pointed at the politician's chest, the hammer cocked and ready. "I wouldn't," Hayes said quietly. "Not with all these witnesses." Reed looked around the room, calculating odds and options. His soldiers were still outside, but inside the schoolhouse, he was outnumbered and outgunned. His political instincts warred with his desperation, and Jake could see him weighing the costs of immediate violence against the benefits of continued deception. "This is treason, Captain Hayes," he said finally. "You're protecting fugitives and interfering with a legitimate government operation." "I'm protecting children from corrupt officials who murdered their father," Hayes replied. "There's a difference. You have no proof of any wrongdoing on my part." "Actually," Sarah Whitmore said, moving to a large wooden chest in the corner of the room, "I have quite a lot of proof." She opened the chest and withdrew a leather portfolio thick with documents and papers. Standing Bear was very thorough in documenting his meetings with territorial officials. Names, dates, specific conversations about gold locations and arms shipments. Everything needed to hang you and Governor Whitman for treason. Reed's face had gone pale. "You're bluffing." Sarah opened the portfolio and began reading aloud. Meeting of March 15, 1879. Present Chief Standing Bear Territorial Advisor Marcus Reed, Colonel James Patterson. Topic: exchange of Apache gold location data for territorial protection guarantees and arms shipments to Sonoran rebels. She looked up from the document with a thin smile. "Shall I continue? There are quite a few more entries." Jake watched Reed's composure crumble as the full scope of his exposure became clear. This wasn't just political corruption, this was documented evidence of international crimes that would bring down the entire territorial administration. "What do you want?" Reed asked, his voice tight with desperation. "Justice," Ayanna said simply. "Justice for my father and all the people who died because of your greed." "And protection for these children," Sarah added. "Full pardons and safe passage to wherever they choose to go." Reed was trapped and everyone in the room knew it, but Jake had learned never to trust a cornered politician. They were the most dangerous kind. "Very well," Reed said finally. "Full pardons for the girls, and I'll personally guarantee their safety." "And Captain Hayes and Mr. Morrison," Sarah pressed. "Them too." Jake didn't believe a word of it, and from the expressions on the others' faces, neither did they. But before anyone could voice their suspicions, young Kaya suddenly stiffened, her eyes going wide with that familiar otherworldly awareness. "They're coming," she whispered. "Many men with guns and torches. They mean to burn everything." Through the windows, Jake could see distant lights moving through the forest, torches carried by men on horseback, approaching fast from multiple directions. "Cordero's men?" Hayes asked. Kaya shook her head. "Different men. Government soldiers, but not the ones outside. These ones smell of desperation and madness." Reed's face lit up with ugly satisfaction. "Ah, that would be Colonel Patterson and his militia company. I sent word ahead that we might need additional support in case of Apache resistance." Jake's heart sank. Patterson was infamous throughout the territory as a man who'd built his career on Apache scalps, someone who viewed negotiations with Indians as weakness and violence as the only effective policy. "You planned this from the beginning," Sarah accused. "You never intended to honor any agreement." "I intended to recover federal property and eliminate security threats to the territory," Reed replied, his political mask firmly back in place. "If a few Apache sympathizers get caught in the crossfire, well, that's the cost of maintaining order." Outside, the sound of approaching horses was getting louder. Jake counted at least 30 men, maybe more, armed and clearly ready for violence. Against that many professional soldiers, their small group wouldn't stand a chance in a straight fight. "The children," Sarah said urgently. "We have to get the children to safety." "Where?" Jake asked. "They've got us surrounded." It was Kaya who provided the answer, her young voice carrying absolute certainty. "The chapel. There are old tunnels beneath it built by Spanish missionaries centuries ago. They lead to caves in the canyon wall." "How do you know that?" Reed demanded. Kaya's obsidian eyes fixed on him with uncomfortable intensity. "The spirits of the missionary fathers still walk these grounds. They remember the days when Apache and Spanish worked together in peace, before men like you brought hatred and greed to poison the land." Reed actually stepped backward, clearly unnerved by the girl's supernatural awareness. But Jake had no time to appreciate the politician's discomfort. The approaching riders would be here within minutes. "Sarah," he said urgently, "gather the children. Get them to those tunnels now." "What about the documents?" she asked. "Take them," Ayanna said. "Take them to the federal officials when they arrive tomorrow. Make sure the truth gets told." Sarah nodded and began stuffing the papers back into the portfolio, but as she did, one document caught Jake's eye, a map drawn on bark covered with Apache symbols he'd seen before. "That's the third piece," he realized, "the final part of the treasure map." Ayanna saw it too, and her face went pale. "My father's greatest secret, the location of the tears of the sun." Reed lunged for the portfolio, but Hayes blocked him with the barrel of his rifle. "I don't think so." "You fools," Reed snarled. "Do you have any idea what you're dealing with? That map leads to enough gold to fund armies, to change the balance of power in the entire Southwest, and you're going to let it fall into the hands of federal bureaucrats who'll bury it in some Washington filing cabinet. Better buried than stolen by murderers," Jake replied. The sound of horses was very close now, and through the windows they could see torches surrounding the mission compound. Colonel Patterson's voice boomed across the valley, amplified by the mountain walls. "Attention, all persons in the mission compound. You are harboring fugitive Apache terrorists and stolen government property. Surrender immediately or face the consequences." "Terrorists," Sarah's voice was incredulous. "They're children. They're symbols of Apache resistance," Reed explained with clinical detachment. "As long as they live, they represent hope that the Apache can resist federal authority. Patterson understands that sometimes symbols must be eliminated." Jake felt sick. These men weren't just after gold or political cover-ups, they were planning genocide disguised as law enforcement. "The tunnels," he ordered. "Everyone out now." They moved quickly through the schoolhouse toward the chapel, Sarah leading the way, while Ihyana and Kaya helped gather the Apache children. Jake and Hayes brought up the rear, watching for signs that Patterson's men were closing in. The chapel was small but beautiful, with wooden pews facing a simple altar adorned with both Christian crosses and Apache symbols, a testament to Sarah Whitmore's belief that faith could bridge cultural divides. But Jake had no time to appreciate the religious artwork. Behind the altar, Kaya was already pulling aside a stone panel to reveal a dark opening in the floor. "The tunnel entrance," she explained. "It leads down to the old Spanish hiding places." One by one, the Apache children disappeared into the darkness, their quiet courage a testament to how often they'd been forced to flee for their lives. Sarah followed them, clutching the portfolio of evidence that would either save them all or die with them in the tunnels. "Go," Jake told Ihyana and Kaya. "I'll be right behind you." But as the girls approached the tunnel entrance, Reed suddenly broke free from Hayes's guard and lunged toward them. His hand closed around Kaya's wrist, dragging her away from the tunnel. "Insurance," he snarled, pressing a derringer to the 12-year-old's head. "The Vision Walker comes with me. The rest of you can disappear into your holes, but she stays topside where Colonel Patterson can find her." "Let her go," Jake commanded his Colt. 45. Appearing in his hand with deadly speed. "I don't think so. This little witch is the key to everything: the gold, the Apache resistance, the federal investigation. With her as proof of my success, I can spin any story I want about what happened here tonight." Kaya looked up at Reed with those impossible black eyes, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of prophecy. "You should not have touched me, Marcus Reed. The Ancient Ones do not forgive such sacrilege easily." Reed laughed, but Jake could hear the nervous edge in it. "Your Apache magic doesn't work on civilized men, child." "Doesn't it?" Kaya asked mildly. The temperature in the chapel suddenly dropped 20 degrees. Frost began forming on the wooden pews, and the oil lamps flickered as if blown by an impossible wind. Outside, the horses could be heard screaming in terror, and men began shouting in confusion as their torches went out one by one. Reed's derringer started smoking in his hand, the metal growing too hot to hold. He dropped it with a curse, releasing Kaya in the process. "What the hell?" His words were cut off as the chapel doors burst open and Colonel Patterson strode in, flanked by a dozen heavily armed soldiers. The colonel was a big man with the weathered face of someone who'd spent his life in violent places, and his eyes held the cold calculation of a predator who'd found his prey. "Mr. Reed," he said pleasantly, "I see you've managed to corner our fugitives." "Colonel, thank God you're here. The Apache children have some kind of witch with them." "I'm aware of the girl's abilities," Patterson interrupted. "That's why I brought special equipment." He gestured to one of his soldiers who stepped forward, carrying a set of iron shackles that seemed to shimmer with their own dark energy. Jake had heard stories of such things, bonds forged with metal blessed by corrupt priests designed to neutralize supernatural abilities. "Spanish iron," Patterson explained with satisfaction, "consecrated in the blood of Apache medicine men. Your little spirit walker won't be calling on any ancestors once these are locked around her wrists." Kaya backed away from the approaching soldier, her supernatural confidence finally cracking to reveal the frightened child beneath. "Ihyana, run," her sister commanded. "Both of you run," but there was nowhere to go. Patterson's men blocked the chapel doors, and the tunnel entrance was too far away to reach before they'd be gunned down. That's when Jacob Morrison made the decision that would define the rest of his life, however long that might be. He stepped between the soldiers and the girls, his Colt 45 trained on Patterson's chest. "That's far enough, Colonel." Patterson looked at him with mild amusement. Jacob Morrison. I remember you from the old days, good soldier, decorated veteran. What are you doing mixed up with Apache savages and government fugitives? Protecting children from men who've forgotten the difference between duty and murder. These aren't children, Morrison. They're enemies of the state carrying stolen government property and practicing witchcraft that threatens the security of the territory. They're refugees, Jake replied firmly. Orphans whose only crime was surviving when their father was murdered by corrupt officials. Patterson's amusement faded. Stand aside, Morrison. I respect your war record, but I won't let sentiment interfere with my mission. And what mission is that murdering children for political convenience? Eliminating threats to territorial stability, says Patterson corrected. These Apache children represent the old ways, the resistance to federal authority that must be broken if we're ever to have peace in this territory. Jake heard the fanaticism in the colonel's voice and realized with growing horror that this man actually believed what he was saying. Patterson wasn't just a corrupt official or a greedy politician. He was a true believer in a cause that required the elimination of Apache culture itself. Last warning, Morrison, Patterson said, his hand moving to his sidearm. Step aside or be considered an enemy combatant. Jake's answer was to cock his revolver, the sound echoing clearly in the small chapel. I've been called worse things by better men, Colonel. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring two veteran soldiers facing each other across a divide that went far deeper than politics or territorial disputes. This was about the kind of nation America would become, one that protected the innocent regardless of race or culture, or one that justified any atrocity in the name of manifest destiny. Then, young Kaya did something that changed everything. She began to sing. It was an Apache song, ancient and haunting, sung in a voice that seemed to carry the grief of her entire people. The melody rose and fell like wind through canyon walls, and as it filled the chapel, something extraordinary began to happen. The Spanish iron shackles in the soldiers' hands began to smoke and crack, the metal splitting apart as if heated beyond its tolerance. The oil lamps blazed brighter, casting dancing shadows on the chapel walls that seemed to move with lives of their own. And through the broken windows came another sound, the war cries of Apache warriors echoing across the valley like voices from the spirit world. Patterson's face went white. Impossible. My scouts reported no Apache war parties in this area. But Jake was looking at Kaya, seeing the tears streaming down her young face as she continued her mournful song, and he understood. This wasn't a war party of living warriors coming to their rescue. This was something far more powerful and far more terrifying. The chapel doors exploded inward as figures began pouring through, but these weren't Patterson's soldiers. These were Apache warriors, but not like any Jake had ever seen. Their skin was pale as moonlight, their eyes burned with otherworldly fire, and they moved with the fluid grace of men no longer bound by earthly limitations. The spirits of the dead had come to protect their children. Patterson's soldiers opened fire, but their bullets passed harmlessly through the supernatural warriors who advanced with implacable purpose toward the men who threatened Apache children. "Fall back!" Patterson screamed. "Everyone out now!" But it was too late. The spirit warriors reached the soldiers, and while they couldn't be harmed by bullets, they could certainly inflict harm themselves. Men screamed as spectral weapons found their mark, and within moments the chapel was filled with chaos and terror. In the confusion, Jake grabbed both girls and pulled them toward the tunnel entrance. Now, while they're distracted, they dove through the opening just as the chapel erupted in supernatural warfare behind them. The tunnel was narrow and dark, but Jake could hear Sarah Whitmore's voice calling from ahead, guiding them toward safety. Behind them, the sounds of battle faded as they moved deeper into the mountain. But Jake knew this was far from over. Patterson might have been driven off by supernatural intervention, but he'd be back with more men and different tactics. The girls had bought them time, but time wasn't victory. As they emerged into a hidden canyon where Sarah and the Apache children waited, Jake realized their desperate flight had only just begun. The real battle for the future of the Arizona Territory and the souls of two remarkable Apache girls was yet to come. But for now, they were alive, they had the evidence that could bring down the conspiracy, and they had allies both living and dead. It was more hope than Jake Morrison had felt in years. And sometimes, hope was enough to change the world. The hidden canyon that sheltered them was a place out of time, carved from red sandstone by countless centuries of wind and water. Ancient Apache symbols decorated the walls, painted in ochre and charcoal by hands that had been dust for generations. A clear spring bubbled from the canyon floor, feeding a small pool where Sarah Whitmore's Apache students now huddled around tiny, carefully concealed fires. Jacob Morrison crouched beside the pool, washing blood from a gash on his forehead where flying debris from the chapel battle had caught him. The cut wasn't serious, but it served as a reminder of how close they'd all come to death in the supernatural chaos that had saved their lives. 12 hours had passed since Kaya's spirit warriors had driven Colonel Patterson's soldiers from the mission school, and Jake knew their reprieve wouldn't last much longer. Patterson was a military man. He'd regroup, bring more troops, and approach the problem with cold, tactical precision instead of rushing in blind. "How long do we have?" Captain Hayes asked, settling beside Jake with his own collection of cuts and bruises. "Not long enough," Jake replied grimly. He looked across the canyon to where Ayanna sat with her sister, both girls surrounded by the Apache children they'd helped save. Even after everything they'd been through, the sisters were still putting others' needs before their own safety. Sarah Whitmore approached them, clutching the leather portfolio that contained Standing Bear's documents. The missionary's face was pale, but determined, and Jake could see the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a physical burden. "I've been reading through these papers more carefully," she said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "What Standing Bear documented. It's worse than I imagined." "How much worse?" Hayes asked. Sarah opened the portfolio and withdrew a map of the Arizona territory marked with notations in Standing Bear's careful handwriting. "The arms trafficking is just part of it. Reed and Governor Whitman have been systematically orchestrating Apache raids to justify land seizures. They've been selling weapons to renegade Apache bands, then using those same attacks as excuses to call in federal troops and declare martial law." Jake studied the map, noting the carefully marked locations where raids had occurred and comparing them to areas where valuable mineral deposits had subsequently been discovered by territorial surveyors. They've been playing both sides, he realized, arming the Apache to attack settlers, then using those attacks to justify taking Apache land, and selling that land to railroad companies and mining corporations for massive profits, Sarah confirmed. Standing Bear uncovered the entire operation during his peace negotiations. That's why they had to kill him. Hayes was examining another document, his face growing darker with each line he read. This lists specific government officials involved in the conspiracy: territorial judges, federal marshals, even Indian Affairs commissioners. The corruption goes all the way to Washington. "Which is why we have to get this evidence to the right people," Sarah said. "Federal investigators who aren't part of the territorial administration, people who can act on this information." Jake looked up from the map, his weathered face grim. "And how exactly do we do that? Patterson has us trapped in this canyon, and every government official in Arizona is either corrupt or dead." It was Kaya who provided the answer, her young voice carrying across the canyon with that familiar otherworldly certainty. "The federal men are coming. The ones with clean hands and honest hearts. They will arrive at the mission tomorrow morning as planned." "How can you know that?" Sarah asked. Kaya's obsidian eyes reflected the firelight like mirrors of the spirit world. "The ancient ones whisper of it. 2 men from the eastern cities sent by the Great Father in Washington to learn the truth about the Apache troubles. They do not know of the corruption, but they seek to understand why the peace has failed." Hayes leaned forward, his military mind already working through the tactical implications. "If we can get these documents to honest federal investigators, we can bring down the entire conspiracy," Sarah finished. "But we have to survive long enough to make the handoff." Jake stood up, his joints protesting after the long day of violence and flight. Through the narrow opening that led into their hidden sanctuary, he could see the first pale light of dawn touching the canyon rim. Soon Patterson would begin his systematic search of every hiding place in the area. "We need a plan," he said. "Something that gets these documents to the federal men while keeping the children safe." "I'll go," Ayanna said, immediately rising from her place beside the other Apache children. "I can reach the mission before Patterson's full search begins." "Absolutely not," Jake replied firmly. "You're the primary target. The moment you show yourself, every gun in Patterson's command will be aimed at you." "Then I'll go," Sarah offered. "I'm a missionary, supposedly neutral in all this. Patterson might let me approach the federal investigators." And what happens when Reed tells Patterson you're harboring stolen government documents? Hayes asked. You'd be arrested before you could say 10 words. Jake was studying the canyon walls, noting the narrow ledges and hidden passages that honeycombed the sandstone formation. His years as a cavalry scout were showing him possibilities that others might miss. There's another way, he said slowly. A way that uses Patterson's own arrogance against him. He outlined his plan as the dawn light grew stronger, explaining how they could turn the colonel's military mindset into a weakness rather than a strength. It was dangerous, more than dangerous. It was nearly suicidal. But it was also their only chance to ensure the evidence reached honest hands. You're talking about walking into a trap, Hayes protested. Patterson will have the entire mission compound surrounded. That's exactly what I'm counting on, Jake replied. Men like Patterson think in terms of force and intimidation. They don't expect their enemies to walk straight into their guns with something other than violence in mind. Ayanna was studying Jake's face with those intelligent dark eyes that saw more than they should. You're not planning to come back from this, are you? The directness of the question hit Jake like a physical blow. He'd been careful not to think too much about the mathematics of his plan. One aging rancher against a company of professional soldiers. The numbers didn't favor survival. I'm planning to make sure you girls have a future, he said quietly. Sometimes that's all a man can do. Kaya stood up and walked to where Jake crouched beside the canyon wall. Her small hand touched his weathered cheek with the gentleness of a daughter saying goodbye to her father. The spirits say you carry too much guilt for things that were not your fault, she said softly. My father's death, your family's death, these were the choices of evil men, not your failures. Jake felt his throat tighten unexpectedly. Your father was a better man than I am. He deserved to live to see his daughters grow up. And your son deserved to grow up with his father, Kaya replied. But the ancient ones do not measure worth by who deserves what. They measure it by what a person chooses to do when faced with evil. She stepped back, her obsidian eyes reflecting depths of understanding that belonged in an ancient prophet, not a 12-year-old girl. You have chosen well, Jacob Morrison. The spirits will remember. An hour later, Jake Morrison walked out of the hidden canyon alone, carrying nothing but his sidearm and the leather portfolio that contained evidence of the most extensive government corruption in territorial history. The morning sun painted the Mogollon Rim in shades of gold and crimson as he made his way through the pine forest toward Sarah Whitmore's mission school. Behind him, concealed in shadows and secret places, Captain Hayes waited with the girls and the Apache children, ready to spirit them away to safety if Jake's desperate gambit failed. The mission compound was exactly what Jake had expected, a fortress bristling with armed soldiers, every building occupied by Patterson's men, every approach covered by rifle fire. The colonel had established his command post in the main schoolhouse, and Jake could see the blue uniforms of territorial militia positioned at strategic points throughout the valley. But Jake had also spotted what he'd been hoping for: two men in Eastern-style business suits standing near the chapel, clearly out of place among the military preparations. The federal investigators had arrived as Kaya predicted, and they were obviously confused by the heavy military presence at what was supposed to be a peaceful mission school. Jake checked his pocket watch, 8:30 in the morning. The investigators would expect to begin their scheduled inspection at 9 Puzras, which gave him 30 minutes to arrange his particular brand of justice. He walked openly down the main trail toward the mission, making no attempt at concealment. Within moments, sentries had spotted him and begun calling alerts. By the time he reached the valley floor, he was surrounded by a full squad of soldiers with rifles trained on his chest. Jacob Morrison. Colonel Patterson's voice carried clearly across the compound as the man himself emerged from the schoolhouse. I was wondering when you'd show yourself. Figured it was time we had a talk, Colonel, Jake replied calmly, his hands well away from his weapon. Patterson approached with the confident stride of a man who held all the cards, his aide-de-camp and several junior officers flanking him like hunting dogs. Jake noticed that Marcus Reed was conspicuously absent, probably hiding in one of the buildings until the dirty work was finished. Where are the Apache children? Patterson demanded. Safe, Jake replied. Somewhere you'll never find them. We'll see about that, My men are quite skilled at extracting information from uncooperative prisoners. Jake smiled grimly. I'm sure they are, but that's not why I'm here. He held up the leather portfolio, noting how Patterson's eyes immediately locked onto it with hungry intensity. I came to make a trade, Jake continued. This portfolio contains everything Standing Bear documented about territorial corruption. Names, dates, financial records, correspondence with federal officials. Everything needed to bring down the entire conspiracy. Patterson's hand moved toward his sidearm. That portfolio belongs to the territorial government. Actually, it belongs to the people of the United States, Jake corrected, and I'm prepared to turn it over to the proper authorities. I am the proper authority in this region. Are you? Jake looked pointedly toward the two federal investigators who were now watching the proceedings with obvious interest. Because those gentlemen over there seem to think they represent federal authority in matters of territorial corruption. Patterson's confident expression flickered as he realized the investigators could hear every word of the conversation. His political instincts warred with his military training, and Jake could see him calculating how to eliminate the threat without creating a bigger problem with federal oversight. Those men are here to conduct a routine inspection, Patterson said carefully. Nothing more. Then you won't mind if I discuss Standing Bear's documents with them, Jake replied pleasantly. I'm sure they'd be very interested in what a murdered Apache chief discovered about arms trafficking and land fraud. One of the federal investigators, a tall, distinguished man with graying hair and intelligent eyes, stepped forward. Excuse me, but did you say murdered Apache chief? We were told Standing Bear died in a raid on a settlement. Jake looked directly at the investigator, seeing the honest curiosity in his face. That's what the territorial government wants you to believe, sir, but the evidence tells a different story. Patterson moved quickly to intercept the conversation. Agent Morrison is a fugitive from territorial justice harboring Apache criminals and stolen government property. Nothing he says can be trusted. Agent Morrison. The federal investigator looked confused. I thought you said your name was Jacob Morrison. It is, Jake confirmed. I was never a government agent. I'm a rancher who made the mistake of helping two starving Apache children. The second investigator, a younger man with the keen eyes of someone accustomed to detecting lies, stepped forward. Sir, I'm Federal Agent William Garrett, Bureau of Indian Affairs. This is Agent Thomas Mason, Department of Justice. We're here investigating reports of irregularities in territorial Indian policy. Jake felt a surge of hope. These weren't territorial officials or corrupt politicians. These were honest federal agents sent to investigate exactly the kind of crime Standing Bear had documented. Then you need to see what's in this portfolio, Jake said, taking a step toward Agent Garrett. Stop right there. Patterson barked, his hand now openly resting on his pistol grip. That man is a fugitive and a threat to territorial security. Agent Mason's expression grew stern. Colonel Patterson, we were told this was a routine inspection of mission school facilities. Why is there a full company of militia present, and why are you treating civilians as military prisoners? Because we're dealing with Apache terrorists and their sympathizers, Patterson replied. This region is under martial law authority. Martial law. Agent Garrett frowned. We received no notification of martial law declarations from territorial headquarters. Jake saw Patterson's political trap closing around him. The colonel had exceeded his authority by declaring martial law without proper federal notification, and the presence of honest investigators was forcing him to either admit his mistakes or compound them with greater crimes. The situation required immediate action, Patterson said defensively. Apache raids have been increasing. Raids orchestrated by territorial officials, Jake interrupted, holding up the portfolio. Standing Bear discovered that Governor Whitman and Marcus Reed have been arming Apache renegades to justify land seizures and federal military intervention. Both federal agents were now staring at Jake with intense interest, their investigative instincts clearly aroused by the specific nature of his accusations. Those are serious charges, Agent Mason said carefully. Do you have evidence to support them? Complete documentation, Jake confirmed. Financial records, correspondence, meeting notes, everything needed to prove systematic corruption reaching from territorial headquarters to Washington itself. Patterson's face had gone pale, but his hand was now gripping his pistol butt with white-knuckled intensity. This man is delusional. The stress of harboring Apache fugitives has clearly affected his judgment. Then, let's examine the evidence, Agent Garrett suggested reasonably. If Mr. Morrison's claims are false, the documents will prove it. I'm afraid that's not possible, Patterson said, his voice tight with barely controlled desperation. The documents in question are classified territorial security materials. Federal agents don't have clearance to examine them. Agent Mason's eyebrows rose. Colonel, we're federal agents investigating territorial administration. We have clearance to examine any documents relevant to our investigation. Jake could see the moment when Patterson realized he was trapped between federal authority and territorial conspiracy. The colonel's military training told him to respect federal agents, but his involvement in the corruption made their presence a mortal threat. It was the moment Jake had been waiting for. Colonel, he said quietly, there's something else you should know about those documents. Patterson turned toward him, his eyes holding the desperate calculation of a cornered animal. They include a complete map to the Apache gold your bosses are so eager to steal. The words hit the compound like a thunderbolt. Jake could see greed and fear warring in Patterson's face, could see similar calculations running through the minds of every soldier within earshot. Gold, Agent Garrett asked sharply. Spanish treasure hidden by Apache ancestors, Jake explained, never taking his eyes off Patterson. Standing Bear offered to share its location as part of his peace negotiations. That's what this whole conspiracy has really been about, not land rights or territorial security, but a fortune in gold that corrupt officials want to steal. Enough! Patterson shouted, his pistol clearing leather with professional speed. You'll hand over those documents now, or I'll shoot you where you stand. But Jake was already moving, diving toward the federal agents while pulling the portfolio against his chest. Patterson's first shot went wide, the bullet splintering wood from the chapel wall behind them. Federal agents, Jake shouted as he rolled behind a water trough. Take cover, these men are traitors. What followed was the most chaotic gunfight Jake had ever experienced. Patterson's soldiers were caught between conflicting loyalties, some following their colonel's orders to eliminate the threat, others reluctant to fire on federal agents who might be innocent civilians. Agent Mason had drawn his own weapon and was returning fire with the calm precision of someone accustomed to dangerous situations. Agent Garrett had taken cover behind the chapel steps, shouting orders for everyone to cease fire and identify themselves. But it was the sound that came from the forest surrounding the mission that truly changed the nature of the battle war, cries echoing from the tree line as Apache warriors emerged from concealment. Not spirit warriors this time, but living men with rifles and decades of experience fighting in exactly this kind of terrain. Jake recognized the lead warrior immediately, Nalnish, the same Apache who had pursued the girls to his ranch. But now the Apache was leading his men in defense of the children he'd once hunted, his painted face grim with righteous purpose. Nalnish, Jake called out in Apache using one of the few words Ayanna had taught him. Friend. The warrior's eyes found Jake's position, and he nodded once in acknowledgement. Then he and his men began the systematic destruction of Patterson's military formation with the tactical precision of fighters who knew every rock and tree in this country. The territorial soldiers caught in crossfire between federal agents and Apache warriors began to break and run. Some threw down their weapons in surrender, others fled toward the forest only to be captured by more Apache waiting in ambush. Through the chaos, Jake saw Patterson rallying a small group of his most loyal men for a final charge toward the chapel where the federal agents had taken cover. The colonel's face was twisted with the fanatic determination of a man who'd rather die than face exposure and disgrace. Jake broke from his own cover, running across the open ground toward Patterson's position. The portfolio tucked under his arm contained the evidence that could bring justice for Standing Bear and his people, but it would be worthless if corrupt soldiers destroyed it, along with the federal agents. Patterson saw him coming and turned his rifle toward Jake's charging form. The colonel's first shot went high. His second caught Jake in the shoulder and spun him around, but momentum carried the aging rancher forward into a tackle that sent both men sprawling. They rolled across the hard-packed earth in a desperate struggle for Patterson's weapon. Two veteran soldiers fighting with the savage intensity of men who understood that only one would walk away from this battle. Jake was older and wounded, but he was also fighting for something greater than his own survival. When Patterson's rifle discharged into the air, Jake managed to tear it from the colonel's grasp and reverse their positions. "It's over, Patterson!" he gasped, the rifle barrel pressed against the colonel's throat. "Your conspiracy is finished." Patterson's eyes were wild with defeat and fury. "You think this ends anything? You think Washington cares about a few dead Apache Whitman has connections all the way to the president's cabinet? Maybe, Jake admitted, but these federal agents will make sure the truth gets told, and sometimes that's enough. The gunfire around them was dying away as the last of Patterson's soldiers surrendered or fled. Jake could hear Agent Garrett calling for medical assistance and Agent Mason taking charge of the surviving territorial militia. But it was the voice that came from the chapel steps that made Jake's heart lift with relief and hope. "Mr. Morrison." He turned to see Ayanna and Kaya running toward him, their faces bright with tears of joy and gratitude. Behind them came Sarah Whitmore and Captain Hayes, along with the Apache children who had found safety in the hidden canyon. "You came back," Kaya said, throwing her small arms around Jake's neck despite the blood seeping from his shoulder wound. "I told you I would," Jake replied, his voice thick with emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel during the desperate fight. "The spirits said you might not survive." Ayanna added, her own tears flowing freely. "They said the cost of justice might be your life." Jake looked at the two girls who had somehow become his daughters in the space of a week, then at the federal agents who were already examining Standing Bear's documents with the intense focus of honest men recognizing historic evidence. "Some things are worth dying for," he said quietly, "but living for them is even better." Agent Garrett approached them, the leather portfolio open in his hands, and his face grim with the weight of what he was reading. "Mr. Morrison," he said formally, "on behalf of the federal government, I want to thank you for bringing this evidence to our attention. What Standing Bear documented here, it's going to change everything." "Will it be enough to bring them to justice?" Sarah Whitmore asked. "More than enough," Agent Mason confirmed, looking up from his own examination of the documents. "We have grounds for federal charges against Governor Whitman Marcus Reed and at least 24 other territorial officials. This conspiracy reaches into multiple government departments and involves federal crimes including arms trafficking, murder, and fraud." "What about the Apache people?" Ayanna asked, her voice carrying the careful diplomacy she'd inherited from her father. "Will this evidence help protect my people from future persecution?" Agent Garrett's expression was thoughtful. "These documents prove that most of the recent Apache raids were orchestrated by corrupt territorial officials. That means the federal government's current policy toward the Apache has been based on deliberately falsified information." He closed the portfolio and looked directly at Ayanna with the respect due to a fellow diplomat. "Miss Standing Bear, I believe your father's dream of a just peace between the Apache and the United States government is about to become reality. These documents will force a complete reevaluation of federal Indian policy in the Arizona Territory." "And the gold?" Jake asked. "The treasure your father offered to share?" Kaya stepped forward, her young face solemn with the weight of ancient responsibility. "The location of the Tears of the Sun belongs to the Apache people. But perhaps if the federal government proves it can honor agreements with our tribe, the treasure could fund schools and hospitals for both Apache and white children." Agent Mason nodded approvingly. "That sounds like exactly the kind of cooperation your father envisioned." As the federal agents organized the capture of evidence and prisoners, Jake found himself standing with Ayanna and Kaya on the chapel steps, looking out over the Mission Valley where their desperate journey had finally reached its conclusion. "What happens now?" Ayanna asked. Jake considered the question, thinking about his burned ranch, his years of bitter isolation, and the unexpected family that had come into his life through tragedy and violence. "Now we build something new," he said finally. "A place where Apache and white children can learn together, where people like your father's vision can become reality instead of just dreams." "You mean the mission school?" Kaya asked. "I mean something bigger than that," Jake replied. His weathered face creased with the kind of smile he hadn't worn in 5 years. "I mean a future worth having." 6 months later, Jake Morrison stood on the porch of his rebuilt ranch house, watching Ayanna teach a group of mixed Apache and white children how to tend the garden that had become Sarah Whitmore's pride and joy. The mission school had been relocated to Jake's land, creating a unique community where cultural bridges were built through daily cooperation rather than political negotiations. Kaya sat in the shade of a cottonwood tree, her young face peaceful as she spoke with spirits only she could see. The conversations were different now, less about ancient grievances and supernatural warfare, more about healing and hope for the future. Captain Hayes had accepted a promotion to Federal Liaison for Apache Affairs, working directly with Agent Garrett to implement the new policies that had emerged from Standing Bear's evidence. The corruption trials had been the sensation of the territorial press, resulting in the removal of Governor Whitman and the complete restructuring of the territorial administration. Marcus Reed had been found guilty of murder conspiracy and treason. He was currently serving a life sentence in federal prison, where Jake hoped he had plenty of time to reflect on the cost of his ambitions. The Tears of the Sun had been found exactly where the combined maps indicated, and the Apache Tribal Council had voted to establish a joint trust fund with the federal government, using the Spanish gold to build schools, hospitals, and infrastructure that would benefit all the people of the Arizona Territory. Papa Jake, Kaya called from her place under the tree, using the name both girls had naturally started calling him. The spirits say Martha and Samuel approve of what you've built here. Jake felt the familiar tightness in his throat that came whenever the girls mentioned his lost family. But it was a good tightness now, the emotion of healing rather than grief. I hope so, he replied. I hope they understand that loving new people doesn't mean forgetting the old ones. Ayanna looked up from her teaching, her scarred face bright with the kind of joy her father had dreamed of for his people. Love doesn't divide, Papa Jake. It multiplies. The more you give away, the more you have. Jake nodded, understanding finally why Martha had always said he had kind eyes. Kindness wasn't something you lost when life hurt you. It was something you chose to keep despite the hurt. As the sun set over the Arizona Territory, painting the sky in shades of hope and redemption, Jake Morrison sat on his porch and listened to the sound of children laughing in 2 languages. It was the most beautiful sound he'd ever heard. Behind him, the past rested in peace. Ahead of him, the future stretched out like a promise finally kept. And beside him, 2 Apache girls who had lost everything and found it again proved that sometimes the greatest treasures aren't buried in secret caves, but carried in the hearts of people brave enough to choose love over hatred, hope over despair, and family over fear. The scar on Ayanna's cheek had indeed marked her as a bridge between worlds, and Jacob Morrison had been blessed beyond measure to help her build it.